Chapter 16, Monasticism. When I woke, it was to Brask's comfortingly incessant pounding on my door. "Everett! Get up! Don't make me disassemble the hinges again." That was normal. What wasn't normal was the bar in my mind. It jumped to 43%, then slid back down to 39%. The timer blinked once. I stared at it in the darkness, puzzled. I had no idea what that mental notification meant. No tooltip. No guiding whisper. But something had shifted. It felt like the good old days back in the gymnasium. Except today, we weren't doing circuits. Today, we were going back into the wilds of Parthosia to risk our lives for the church and their petty acquisitions. Every day, I felt less like I was being saved and more like I was being spent. Whatever that glimmer of hope I once felt in the first week, it was now fading fast. I called through the door. "I'll meet you in the mess. Go without me." Brask grunted but moved on, boots thudding down the hall. I sat up, rubbed the dried blood from my cheek where my eye had wept red during the night. My head still ached, but it was a dull throb. Manageable. I packed my gear in silence. I walked the curved path to Ka-Ur-U's lab. It smelled stronger than usual today. It was like coppery steam and rusted lemon rind, a side effect of whatever he'd boiled overnight. When I knocked, the door groaned open under its own weight. Ka-Ur-U looked up, goggles tight and lenses whirring. "Back so soon? Returning this?" I handed him the field slate. "And asking for more." He took the slate gingerly. "You actually finished the full treatise? That takes most of the field apprentices' 3-week cycles." "I guess it's a compass thing," I said. "Don't discount yourself. Gnosis moves through clever channels. What do you need?" "Field wards. Not the permanent kind. I need something I can deploy fast. Some kind of perimeter shroud. Maybe something that keeps the eyes and noses off us when we bed down." Ka-Ur-U began pulling items from his many cubbyholes. "You'll want the 33-weight mesh. Draw the pattern first, then unroll. Bind it with a shard of copper or your own blood, but not both. The glyph tags are keyed to short bursts. They are good for an hour or two." I nodded as I packed the items into my bag. The pack was heavier this time, filled with items I'd asked Ka-Ur-U for in preparation: the glyph etch stakes, a folded field ward mesh, blank parchment tags. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Use them well." "And Everett?" I looked up. "The world changes faster than you think. You're changing too. Don't forget to keep track of what you've left behind." I left without another word. The walk to the mess was quiet. My boots made no sound on the oil-dark concrete. I passed murals I hadn't noticed before during my walks. They were like old sermons burned into plaster, like fossilized intentions. Something about the quiet made the space feel older. It had only been 2 weeks. Yet I was already reminiscing like the time had been years. I suppose that put the danger of Parthosia into perspective. Everything here aged quickly: our flesh, trust, certainty. Brask and Marcy were already seated. A tin tray clattered as Brask dropped it onto the table, metal thudding like a bell. The smell of boiled roots and something gray that might have been meat hit me as I approached. "There he is," Brask said. "I was about to go fetch you again." "Let him eat in peace," Marcy said, swatting his arm. "He probably needed the extra sleep after his first date with the wilds." I sat. The meal was meager, but it filled the space in my stomach where fear tried to nest. Brask leaned in. "So I might have mentioned how well we handled our last outing." Marcy rolled her eyes. "He bragged. Again." "I reported," Brask said, drawing out the word. "And maybe I implied that a week wasn't enough to tire us." Marcy stepped on his foot under the table. He winced, hard. "So, guess who volunteered us for another deep crawl?" "Let me guess," I said. "You did?" "Yup. 1 week out. Same assignment window. Just deeper." I didn't respond. Just shoveled in another bite and tried to ignore the spike of tension in my chest. "We can still ask for a different rotation," Marcy said, eyes still on me. "Something closer to the yard. Patrol work." It is not cowardice to say the last route came too close. There was a part of me that wanted to take that offer and cling to it. To say yes, to admit that the thought of another week outside made my stomach feel hollow. Instead I shook my head. "You think they would listen?" I asked. She held my gaze for a second and then looked away. "No. Probably not." Brask pushed his tray aside and stood. "Then we do not waste time. Come, Monk. The captain does not enjoy waiting." The mess hall noise fell away behind us as we stepped into the corridor. The air out here always smelled different, like stone dust and old metal. The murals on the walls watched us pass, the paint cracked and smoked by incense over too many cycles. I remembered walking here those first days when everything had felt unreal, like a tour through someone else's nightmare. Now the quarters felt ordinary, which alarmed me more than the murals ever had. "Same office as before?" I asked. "Of course," Brask said. "Important men do not move their nests without cause." "Maybe don't call it a nest to his face," Marcy said. Brask grinned, teeth bright in the low light. "I am very respectful." We took the familiar turn toward the deeper halls. My shoulders remembered the weight of the pack from our first outing. Today's pack pulled at the same places, but it sat differently. The 33-weight mesh Ka-Uru had given me pressed like a folded sheet of chain across the bottom. The glyph stakes clinked softly when I stepped wrong. The new tags, blank and waiting, rustled in their oilskin envelope. I focused on the feel of each item. The coiled pistol by my hip. The knife with its edge Ka-Uru had re-etched. The mesh that might keep us unseen for an hour if I remembered the pattern correctly. I traced the route automatically as we walked, letting the ocular knob sense unfurl in the back of my skull. Walls, turns, doors, pressure changes in the air, they all slotted into position, forming a quiet diagram I could lean on without looking. The captain's door waited where it always did, a heavy slab of reinforced metal set into an alcove that was cleaner than the rest of the hall. The stone around it had been scrubbed to a dull matte, the old grime worked out of the seams. A single strip of light ran along the top, steady and white. Brask cracked his knuckles twice against the metal. "Enter." Lenendris's voice came through muted but clear. Brask opened the door and ducked in, tail swaying. Marcy and I followed. The captain's office, if it deserved that word, was almost exactly as I remembered. The floor was plain stone, swept bare. Shelves lined two walls, filled with slates, paper-thin circuit boards, and stacks of actual paper bound with copper wire and pinned diagrams and maps covering any empty space. The central table carried the same stretched map as before, but new layers had been added. Thin strips of translucent material were pinned across sections, some marked with ink, some crosshatched in bold strokes. Lenendris stood behind the table, leaning slightly on his hands. His sleeves were rolled up past the altered tendons in his forearms. The faint mechanical seams along his fingers flexed as he tapped a stylus against the mapped surface. A pipe sat cold in the dish beside him, the last tendrils of smoke already dispersed. "Cohort 3, he said. "Good. Sit." We took the same places as in the debrief. Brask to my left, Marcy to my right. The bench creaked under Brask's weight. My pack settled against my spine, a reminder that there would not be a delay between this conversation and whatever came next. Lenendris watched us over the map. His eyes caught the light in that glassy way that made it difficult to tell exactly where he was looking. "I heard your report," he said. "I read it again this morning." Brask smiled. "It was very thorough." "That is one word," Lenendris said. "The church liked the part where you did not die. A successful hunt, etc." He shifted the stylus to his other hand. "What they did not like was this." He tapped the map. The stylus clicked against a patch of translucent overlay near the quadrant marker I recognized. Our last route traced a faint line through it in red, loops and turns annotated with tiny sigils. The overlay above that portion had been shaded in with tight, deliberate crosshatching, dark enough that the underlying details were barely visible. Marcy leaned forward. "That overlay was not there last time." "No," Lenendris replied. "Because last time, the strata were stable enough to trust the old survey. That is no longer the case." He picked up a small brass rod from the edge of the table and used it to tap along the crosshatched area. 12 hours after your return, the watchers on the upper ridge reported a structural shift. Subfloor collapse and unknown mechanical activity. The cameras we used for monitoring in that section failed and stopped returning any input. Their signals cut out along this band. He dragged the rod across the shaded patch. Remote readings in adjoining areas now show interference. The sensors report back as if there were some kind of nullification field. "Null field," Brask repeated. "That sounds unpleasant." "Yes? It sounds unknown," Lenendris said. "I and my superiors dislike the unknown." "I do," he said. "But not only there. We will extend your patrol window by one sector. Outward and slightly down. Quadrant 3v1.58 through 3v1.63. Brask's ears perked. "Deeper. Good. The meat is better where the light does not reach enough." Lenendris gave him a flat look. "You will take hunts if they are clean and convenient. You will not chase them. The church is adjusting priorities in your band. Harvest is now secondary." Marcy's eyebrows rose. "Secondary to what?" "Navigation," he said. He set the brass rod down and opened a drawer built into the underside of the table. From it he drew out a thin slate, smaller than the field reader Ka-Uru had lent me, and without the usual border of interface lights. Its surface was a muted gray, matte and inert. He held it out toward me. I hesitated for a heartbeat before standing to take it. The slate was lighter than it looked, the surface subtly textured. "What is it?" I asked, although I already had a guess. "Cartographic slate," Lenandris said. "Old pattern, refit for your skill set. It does not record automatically. It is not a camera." He gestured for me to sit again. I did, the slate resting across my knees. "Your first outing showed certain tendencies," he continued. "You retraced your route without guidance when we needed to escape the lower supports. You kept track of our distance from the gate without watching a clock. You described the kill site with enough detail that the archivists could reconstruct a model from memory alone." He paused. "Ka-Uru's readings from your scans confirmed a change in your perceptual cortex after the Ruin Watch." I stiffened. "You read those?" "Of course," he said. "You bear a crown in our service. We monitor the effects. Your ocular nerve gland came online sooner than projected, however the gland is one of the highly researched possible outcomes for your crown. You have what the sermons would call a gift and what I call a tool. We intend to use it." The language sat cold in my chest. "Tool." Again. "What exactly do you want me to do?" I asked. Lenandris pointed to the slate. "When you are in the field, you will pay attention. You will let that new sense of yours drink in the routes you take. Distances. Junctions. Load-bearing structures. Any visible sign that the strata are shifting faster than the models predict. Each time you make camp, you will use that slate to fix what you saw. The slate will not fill itself. You will draw. You will annotate. You will mark hazard sites, vents, and anomalies. And when we come back," Marcy said slowly, "you will feed that into the yard's master map." "Yes," Lenandris said. "We do not have enough functioning automatons to keep every band current. The deeper crews are overstretched. Your cohort survived a surprise GOG level and brought back useful data. That makes you valuable." Brask preened. "I always knew we were special." "You are currently alive," Lenandris corrected. "Which is uncommon enough in the jobs you have." His gaze returned to me. "Understand something, Monk. In this assignment, Brask and Marcy will still serve as your blades and keys. They will keep threats off your back. Your primary duty is your head. You are to return with it intact and filled with information. If that means you avoid a fight that you could otherwise take, you avoid it. I do not care how hungry Brask gets." "That seems unfair," Brask said mildly. "That is church policy," Lenandris replied. I looked down at the slate again. The surface recorded nothing of the room around us. No reflection. No flicker. It was simply waiting. "How detailed do you expect this to be?" I asked. "Lines and turns? Or more?" "As much as you can give," Lenandris said. "Do not clutter it with meaningless trivia. Focus on what affects movement and survival. Load paths. Choke points. Reliable cover. Any growth that carries unusual characteristics. The archivists will extract patterns when you return. We will compare your field sketch to the old survey. Whatever does not match will be marked for further attention." "What happens if we do not come back?" Marcy asked. Lenandris's expression did not change. "Then this band of the map remains blank. And the next cohort sent in will go in blind. I would prefer to avoid that." He straightened and set the stylus down carefully in its groove. "You leave within 3 hours," he said. "Gate 7 again. Your assignment window is 10 days. You know the standard conditions. Purity. Compliance remains in effect. If your timer behaves in ways that concern you, you will report it immediately to Ka-Uru when you return. If it behaves in ways that risk the cohort before that, your companions have authority to restrain you and call for extraction." His eyes settled on me as he said it. I felt heat creep up my neck. "Do you expect it to misbehave?" I said lightly, almost joking. "I expect the unexpected," he said. "You are compass aligned. The path of seekers is not a tidy one. The last thing I need is another Puritan incident like last night because someone decided to keep an anomaly secret." The memory of the man splitting apart during the sermon rolled over me. The timer that had not broadcast. The smell. The sound of vertebrae separating like wet corks. I swallowed. "I will report anything that feels wrong." He watched me for a beat longer, as if weighing that promise, then nodded once. "Good. Brask, Marcy, you will review hazard updates for your sector with the wardens in the antechamber. There have been new fungal blooms near the old vent basin. You will treat them as toxic until proven otherwise. No souvenirs, that means you Brask." Brask clicked his tongue. "You ruin all my fun." Your fun is dangerous, Lenandris said. Dismissed. We stood. I slipped the cartographic slate into the inner sleeve of my pack where it would not crack if I fell. Lenandris's gaze tracked the motion. There was the faintest hint of satisfaction when he saw where I placed it. Outside the office, the corridor felt narrower. Brask blew out a breath and rolled his shoulders. That went very well, I think. You would say that after any meeting where you are not hit, Marcy said. This is a reasonable measure of success, Brask agreed. Marcy looked at me again. How does it feel? Which part? I asked. The part where I am being sent back into a shifting death maze, or the part where my brain is now officially church property? She huffed a quiet, humorless laugh. Bothy guess? But I meant the gland. I thought about it as we walked. The ocular nerve sense pressed gently at the back of my skull, already mapping this short stretch of corridor, tracing the angles where walls met ceiling, the tiny chips in the stone where boots had scuffed over years. If I closed my eyes, I could still see Brask's ears, the exact tilt of Marcy's shoulders, the way the lamplight pulled around a crack in the floor. It feels crowded, I said finally. Like my head is a room that someone keeps adding shelves to. Every round. Every turn. It all suddenly wants to stay whether I like it or not. Useful shelves, Brask said. We will put many skulls on them. Marcy elbowed him. You are not helping. He grinned. I am trying. I checked the bar again. Because I could not stop myself. 39%. The timer had ticked once, then settled and was now on blinking. The text in the corner of my awareness stayed silent, but after Brask's comment I almost expected to see that familiar line again. Do you trust it? Marcy asked quietly, as we turned toward the dormitory wing. The timer? I asked. The crown, she said. The compass. The things it is doing to you. I thought of Ka'uru's warning that compass bearers often went mad. Too many threads. Too much signal. I thought of the throne room in my domain, of the mist and the thing I had dragged into it. Of the man who had stepped out, calling me sacred. I think that it wants something, I said. I do not know if that something is good for me. My mind bar blinked to 40% but Brask cut in. Then we will watch you, yes? Brask said. His voice lost some of its usual brightness. If you start walking in circles, we will hit you with a rock and drag you home. Very reassuring, I murmured. It worked for my cousin, he said. Marcy shook her head, but a small smile had crept onto her mouth. Pack what you need, she said to me. We meet at the gate hall in 2 hours. And Brask, you're just as likely to go insane out there. But surely that won't happen to me, yes? For I am far too smart to lose my grip on reality. Marcy rolled her eyes. This time I cut in. I already packed. We left right away last time but I could use the time to prep. I'll see you at the gate. We split at the junction. They continued toward the briefing annex. I turned toward the dormitory, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. Inside my cell, I put my pack down and looked around the tiny cell of a room. The barodex stacked against the wall. The spare robe folded at the end of the cot. I set the pack on the cot and opened it, working through the contents with deliberate care. Coiled pistol. Checked and rechecked. Extra cells wrapped in cloth to keep them from oxidizing. Knife. Whetstone. The folded 33-weight mesh, etched with faint lines where the pattern would need to be traced before deployment. Glyph stakes, each with a tiny tag of metal ready to take charge. Small wax pencils. Rope. Water flasks. I pulled the cartographic slate back out and set it on my knees as I sat. The surface remained dull. I reached for the wax pencil, hesitated, then used the pad of my thumb instead. The moment my skin touched the slate, a faint grid bloomed across it, thin lines of light mapping out an invisible scale. My thumb left no mark, but I felt a slight static prickle. My ocular nerve sense responded. I closed my eyes and thought of the route from the mess to Lenandris's door. The turns. The junction where the corridor sloped down. The way the murals had repeated every 3 doorways on the left hand. I opened my eyes, realized there was a stylus and began to draw. The stylus glided across the surface with less resistance than paper, but just enough to keep me from slipping. Lines appeared where I pressed, clean and sharp. Each time I paused to remember, the map in my head settled more firmly. The slate seemed to pull the image out of me, not with force, but like a path of least resistance. When I finished the rough route, I sat back and studied it. It was not beautiful. I had never been an artist. The lines were slightly uneven. The angles were guesses where I had not been able to measure. But the proportions felt right. I could point to any turn on the slate and then close my eyes to stand in the matching place in memory, feel the air there, Smell the particular mix of incense and rust. That will do, I said softly. I wiped the grid with the side of my hand, testing. The lines held. Good. I would not have to redraw every time I brushed the surface. Packing the slate again felt heavier than before, even though I knew logically the mass had not changed. I took the pack, swung it over my shoulders, and fastened the clasp. The fabric still smelled faintly of fungus from the ducts, as if the cold air of that place had soaked into the fibers and refused to leave. I tucked the last strap, checked the defunct bioport at the base of my neck by touch, and felt the familiar ring of metal there. The skin was tender, but no more than usual. For a moment I stood in the center of the small room and just breathed. In. Out. The crown's presence hummed somewhere behind my thoughts, quiet but constant, like a machine running several floors below. 2 hours, give or take, until I had to appear at gate 7. Which meant, if I was careful, I had time. I sat on the cot and let the pack rest against my knees. The lamplight painted a small circle on the concrete and left the corners of the room in shadow. I lowered my head and followed the familiar path inward. Breath first. 17 full draws. Each one slower than the last. On the 12th breath, the room began to thin, edges softening at the corners of my vision. On the 17th, I let the weight of my body go, trusting the ritual that had already taken root in my nerves. The cell folded. Stone and pipe peeled away like layers of a diagram being erased and redrawn. The air cooled, then warmed, then settled. Columns rose in their place, white stone veined with brass. The floor darkened beneath my feet until it became the black glass again, laced with red gold thread. Light filtered in from high alcoves, without any real source, like a memory of daylight replayed. My throne waited where it always did now, at the far end of the long table. The mist came last. It bled from the walls in low coils, a soft red haze that never quite touched me, curling around chair legs and the distant arches. It smelled faintly of copper and incense. I stepped forward and sat. The throne accepted my weight with that same quiet acknowledgement, a pulse of warmth through the back of the seat and into my spine. My hand brushed the table's edge. Thin circuits flared to life beneath my palm, obsidian and gold lines crawling across the surface until they converged near the center. The pendulum rose from that point. It was the same shape as before, but different too. Sharper. More defined. The chain was a fine copper, each link etched with characters too small to read. The weight at the end was a teardrop of onyx shot through with a seam of gold, polished to a mirror sheen. It hung above a shallow basin ringed with tiny sigils. The domain had taken the crude drawing I carried in the outside world and made it into something that fit here. A polished version of my own work. For a heartbeat, I almost called Severance instead. The thought came with a rush of remembered details. The loop of chain that had dropped over his shoulders. The sigils burned into the stone chair that held him in place here. His face turned up toward me, blood slick and reverent. The way my eyes had burned and bled when I let the domain bear the weight of that performance. I lifted a hand halfway, fingers curling as if to summon him, and stopped. If I dragged Severance in again, it would not be gentle. I could feel it. Last time I was left with blood on my face and a headache that felt like my skull was 2 sizes too small. I could not hide that from Brask and Marcy, not with a 10-day assignment about to start and half the church watching. Incessant bleeding of the eyes in the gate hall would raise questions I could not afford. Not today, I said quietly to the empty air. Instead, I focused on the pendulum. Last time, it had been a simple yes or no. A single line of swing in a flat circuit. Crude. Risky. It had worked, but it had almost broken me the moment I asked it for more than that. This time I wanted something better. The basin under the pendulum was bare. Smooth black surface, ringed by the neat circle of tiny glyphs. I could imagine the layout I wanted there as clearly as I had once imagined sigils on notebook paper back on Earth. 4 answers, at least, not 2. Yes. No. Maybe. Rephrase. I had read about that kind of divination when it was still just an internet curiosity. People chalking circles with labeled segments and letting pendulums swing above them. Full boards instead of a simple line. It felt childish then. It did not feel childish now. 4 points, I murmured. The domain listened, or at least it felt like it did. I did not reach for chalk. There was none here. Instead I flattened my hand over the edge of the basin and thought about what I wanted the surface to show. A cross first, simple and clean. One axis for yes or no. The other for maybe and rephrase. Then finer divisions along each path, so the swings were not forced into perfect lines. Enough give for nuance without losing the core answer. The circuits along the table brightened. Faint lines spread from under my palm, feeding into the lip of the basin. The smooth floor inside it rippled once, like the surface of water accepting a stone, then settled. New markings burned themselves into place. The basin now held a shallow compass rose carved in light. 4 main arms radiated from the center, etched with clear sigils I recognized as simple words. Affirm. Deny. Unclear. Recast. Smaller lines lay between them, unlabeled but present, like the promise of more detailed readings if I learned the language. The pendulum hung above the center point, chain motionless. I swallowed once and let my hand fall away. "All right," I said. "Question time." My voice sounded very small against the scale of the hall. "Am I on the right path?" The words left my throat and hung in the mist for a moment. The circuits along the table pulsed once with a low golden glow. The pendulum twitched, then began to sway. No wind moved it. No hand touched the chain. It simply answered. The swing started small, a tight circle above the very center of the compass. Then it began to favor one side. The arcs grew longer, steadier. My heart kept pace with each pass. It settled not on yes, not on no, but just shy of the line that marked unclear. Maybe. The weight traced that path, steady as a metronome. Every time it swung, the light under the maybe arm brightened. I clenched my jaw. "Of course," I muttered. "Maybe." Balanced on the edge of right and wrong. On the edge of survival and failure. A map without a legend. It was honest in its own way, but not helpful. "Fine," I said. "Time for a better question." I let the pendulum slow. It did not stop until I drew a breath and willed it to stillness. The chain quieted. The weight hovered. Is my plan to fool the church a good plan? The moment the word fool left my mouth, the circuits around the basin flickered. The pendulum jerked once and then swung hard, not toward yes, not toward no, but toward the recast segment. Rephrase. The sigil there burned brightest, a neat, precise reminder. I stared at it, irritation rising sharp and hot. "You understood that just fine," I argued. "Come on, don't pretend you did not." The pendulum did not care. I pinched the bridge of my nose and tried again, changing the shape of the thought even as I shaped the words. Is my intention to mislead the church to my benefit and good fortune, thus a good idea for me? It was clumsy, but at least it spelled out the selfishness in it. This time, the pendulum's reaction was slower. It started that same small circle, then drifted. The weight pulled again toward uncertainty. It did not touch yes, did not touch no. It hovered in that annoying band between, the light under unclear pulsing gently. Maybe, again. I let out a long breath and ran a hand back through my hair. "What good are you?" I said. The complaint echoed up into the arches and came back small. The pendulum finally stilled. Magic, if that was the right word for this, was not a shortcut to certainty. It was more like an annoyingly precise teacher. It refused to solve the problem for me. It only underlined the parts I had not thought through. I leaned back on the throne and watched the faint movements of the mist near the far columns. Here, in the domain, time did not press as hard. My timer sat somewhere in the background of my mind, still ticking away in the outside world, but the pressure of each second felt stretched. 2 hours out there would be much more in here. Enough, if I was careful, to think. My gaze drifted past the pendulum, down the length of the table, toward the circle of stone where Severance's chair stood. The chain still curled around the chair's arms, links made of dense script. The sigils burned into the stone were faint but legible. I had not been entirely conscious of what I was doing when I summoned them last time. I had relied on theater and instinct. On the domain's willingness to meet me halfway. Now that my pulse had steadied, I looked properly. The binding pattern was not simple. Lines of script snaked along the chair's frame, converging in knots at the joints. They formed a ring around the base, another around the back, both filled with smaller characters. Some I recognized from ritual diagrams. Others were new. It was still a spell. A real one. The domain had taken the rough shape of my intent and layered an actual binding structure over it. "If you can do that," I said softly to the hall, "what else can you do for me?" The idea pulled at something in my chest. Severance was bound because I wanted him held here. I had not known how to craft that kind of sigil sequence before. The domain had interpreted my will, translated it into runes and structure I could not have invented alone. It had acted like the pendulum did. Did the domain increase my power, like an applied buff? Or did it simply allow me to speak a language I was not fluent in yet, filling the gaps where my knowledge failed? Either way, it had taken my half-formed want and turned it into real architecture. I looked back at the pendulum. Its current form was useful, but bare. 4 answers. Subtlety hidden between the lines if I learned to read them. But that was not all divination could be. On Earth, divination tools sometimes did more than yes or no. Some spun wheels. Some cast lots. Some laid out cards that could show paths instead of simple answers. I thought of childhood fantasies, of the way I once wished for an admission letter to a school that did not exist, for teachers who could show me how this kind of thing worked. "You are not Hogwarts," I said to the throne room. "But maybe you can still meet me halfway." I placed my palm over the basin again, fingers brushing the chain. "Show me more than a swing," I said. "Take this pattern and make it into something that can map options, not just verdicts. Something that can show me where my questions lead." I did not know if that was a valid demand in whatever rules govern this place. I knew only that the last time I had asked for something with that level of focus and flourish, the domain had listened. I thought of instruments I had seen in history books. Brass wheels layered on wheels. Tiny marks indicating stars, horizons, seasons. Tools for sailors and astronomers to navigate when there was nothing but sky and sea. An astrolabe. But not one for constellations. One for decisions. I held that image in my mind and pushed. The circuits along the table flared brighter, then narrowed. The basin deepened by a hand's width, its edges rising like the lip of a shallow bowl. The mist near the ceiling twisted, as if a wind had passed through it. Metal groaned, not in my ears, but in the bones of the room. The pendulum shuddered. The basin's flat floor separated into layers. Thin rings rose from the surface, each one a disc of dark metal inlaid with etched lines. They stacked themselves into a small tower of wheels, each slightly smaller than the one below. The pendulum's chain lengthened to accommodate the change, its weight now hanging within a cage of interlocking circles. When the motion stopped, I let go of my breath. The simple pendulum had become something else. The astrolabe was the size of a large plate, set into the surface of the table as if it had always belonged there. The outermost ring bore the same 4 core sigils as before: yes, no, unclear, recast, but they repeated in a pattern along its circumference, broken by tiny ticks and markers. Inside that, another ring turned freely, studded with 7 smaller glyphs arranged in a loose arc. I did not recognize them immediately, but they felt like categories. Risk. Cost. Time. Things like that. The sense was fuzzy, but present. The third disc held compass marks without letters, dividing the space into finer segments, like the face of a strange clock. At the center, beneath the pendulum's hanging weight, the smallest wheel was a dense cluster of script, spiraling inward to a point. It gave the impression of depth, as if I could fall through it if I stared too long. The pendulum itself had changed as well. The onyx weight now carried a thin band of etched symbols around its widest point. They glimmered faintly as it moved, like a ring of satellites around a dark planet. Pendulum divination on steroids. The idea made something in my chest tighten with a mix of excitement and fear. "All right," I said. "Let's see what this bad boy can do." I positioned the outermost ring so that one of the yes sigils lay at the top, aligned with the head of the table. The no sat opposite it. Unclear and recast fell to the sides. The 7-category ring beneath, I left as the domain had set it, not knowing yet what each symbol meant. I steadied the pendulum with 2 fingers. "Same question," I said. "Am I on the right path?" I released the weight. For a few heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the smallest central disc began to turn, slow and deliberate, words spiraling under the pendulum. The second ring twitched, then slid 3 notches. The outer ring stayed fixed. Only when the wheels had found whatever alignment they wanted did the pendulum swing. This time, the motion was not a simple line. The weight traced an ellipse that cut across both yes and unclear, favoring neither entirely. Each time it passed over the border, the glyphs there brightened in response. The 7-symbol ring beneath highlighted 2 of its sigils with a faint glow as the weight crossed them. I did not know their exact meaning, but I could feel the impression they carried. One tasted like danger. The other tasted like an opportunity. Both sat under the maybe edge of the path. The answer had not changed. Still maybe. But the astrolabe had added context to the words. Maybe, with risk and potential tangled together. I swallowed. "Fine," I said. "Next." I waited until the pendulum calmed and the discs settled. Then I took a breath and framed the question more carefully. Is my intention to keep my mind and will free from the Church's control a path I can survive taking? The words felt heavier as I spoke them. More honest. The astrolabe reacted at once. The outer ring rotated half a segment on its own, aligning a yes marker more directly with the head of the table. The middle ring shivered and shifted, bringing 3 of its smaller glyphs under the pendulum's resting point. The central spiral tightened until the script there was a dense knot. The pendulum dropped to one side, then swung. The arc crossed yes most strongly, but the line did not stay clean. The very tail of the swing brushed unclear each time it returned. The lit categories beneath carried a mix that settled in my chest with a strange familiarity. Cost. Time. Secrecy. I did not know how I knew those words, but they formed bright in my mind anyway. Yes, the instrument said. You can try. But it will not be simple, and the margin between success and failure is thin. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Better, I said. That, I can work with. I let the pendulum slow. The circuits dimmed to a gentle glow. I did not push further. The last time I had demanded too much from this place, my body had paid for it in blood and pain. I stood from the throne. The hall remained vast and steady. Severance's chair waited at the far end of the table, chains quiet, sigils dim. I did not look at his place long. That will have to do for today, I said to the empty palace. With a thought, I loosened my hold on the domain. The columns faded first, their edges softening into shadow. The onyx floor thinned, the red gold veins dissolving into the bare concrete of my cell. The throne and table went last, the astrolabe's ring spinning once in a silent rotation before collapsing into a single point of light that winked out. I opened my eyes. The lamplight over my cot hummed. The pack still rested where I had left it. My hands were steady. I touched my cheek and found no trace of fresh blood at my eyes or nose. The dull ache in my skull had not grown worse. Good. I rolled my shoulders, feeling the weight of the pack straps as I swung it up again and settled it properly. The cloak rasped softly as I pulled it from the peg and shrugged into it. The fabric smelled of damp stone and old ducks, grounding me in a way the throne room never could. One last look around the tiny room. The borrowed text stacked neatly against the wall. The folded spare robe. The empty basin. My world, reduced to a few objects and the space inside my skull. On the right path, maybe, I said under my breath. Trying to stay free, yes. That will have to be enough. I tightened the last strap, reached for the door latch, and stepped out into the corridor, heading toward the gate hall and whatever waited in the shifting dark beyond. Chapter 17, Cartography. The walk to the meeting point felt shorter than it had the first time. My feet knew the route now. Halfway along, my ocular knob sense stirred on its own, mapping distance and slope even though I had not consciously called it up. I checked the bar in my mind out of habit. 40%. Timer steady. No messages. The hall that fed toward Gate 7 stretched ahead, long and straight. The stone here had been scoured cleaner than most places in Horace Yard. No murals, no devotional graffiti. Just bare walls and the faint grooved marks of heavy crates dragged to and from the outer bands. It felt like someone had tried very hard to scrub any personality out of the space. I reached the point where the floor markers indicated our mustering line and stopped. My sense of time slotted the moment neatly. I knew, without looking at a clock, that I was early by a few minutes. Maybe it was a compass thing. Or maybe it was just me. I settled my pack more comfortably on my shoulders and waited. The quiet here had a particular quality to it. Not the layered murmur of the mess or the distant clang of the training halls, but a held breath. The sort of hush you got in hospital corridors just outside operating rooms, where everyone pretended they were not listening for alarms. Bootsteps eventually broke it. 2 sets. One heavier and slightly uneven, claws scraping faintly. One light and measured. Brask and Marcy turned the corner together. Brask's grin appeared first. "Look at that," he said. "The monk is early." "I am on time," I said. "You are late." Marcy checked the wall clock set above the last door. "He is not wrong," she said. "We cut it close." Brask waved this away. "The gate never opens on the very tick. There is always something broken that needs hitting first." He eyed my pack. "You changed the load," he said. "Heavier." "Surprises," I said. "And a drawing slate. Lenenders wants my head full when I come back." "Then we will make sure you bring it back," Brask said easily. "Preferably still attached to your neck." Marcy studied my face for a moment, as if checking for any fresh signs of strain from whatever I had done in my cell. Seemingly finding none, she nodded once. We moved together down the last stretch of corridor. The air cooled as we approached the gate chamber. My shoulders tightened in anticipation of the quiet brutality that space always carried. Gate 7's outer hall was guarded by the same church cadre as last time. 4 of them stood at the corners of the antechamber. Their robes were a dense, off-white cloth, thick enough that I could not see any outline of their bodies beneath. High-pointed hoods rose above blank masks. 3 had the cloth masks with a black bar, but 1 had a mask of smooth ceramic. The mask had small vertical slits for sight and breathing, nothing more. No insignia, No rank markers. Just faceless whiteness over heavy fabric. They reminded me too much of the old clan images from history lessons. It hit the same parts of my brain that processed cult documentaries and lynching photos. Power wrapped in anonymity, using sacred language as a weapon. Their presence made the wardens and technicians operating the door move more carefully. We crossed the threshold. One of the robed figures, the leader with the mask of white, stepped forward, cutting us off with a lift of his hand. "Cohort 3, he said. His voice came distorted through whatever filtration lay under the mask, but the disdain carried clean. "Inspection." This was the first time one of the robed figures had talked to me. We stopped. I spread my arms without being told. Brask and Marcy did the same. The guard moved in a slow circle around us, accompanied by another at his shoulder. They checked gear first. Pack straps. Weapon clasps. Bioports. The guard's fingers were gloved, but I could feel the precision in his touch. No wasted motion. He paused at the base of my neck, palm hovering over the dead obelisk bioport. "This one is sealed," he said. "Obsolete hardware," I said before I could stop myself. "Corporate brand. Your people already checked it when I arrived." His hand froze. For a heartbeat, the hall felt even quieter. Brask's tail stiffened behind me. I felt the air change next to my shoulder where Marcy had gone very still. The guard stepped around in front of me. We were close enough that I could see the faint imperfections in the ceramic of his mask, tiny bubbles in the glaze. "You are familiar with church procedure?" he asked. I swallowed. "I am familiar with being searched," I said. "It happens a lot to people like me." The part of my brain that handled survival screamed at me to shut up. Another part of me, the one that had been watching the church since the sermon incident and cataloging every flaw in its armor, wanted answers. The guard held my gaze through the slit of his mask. "Last night," I said, before I could talk myself out of it, "in the sermon hall. The Puritan. Does your office know why his timer failed to broadcast?" Behind me, Marcy made a small shock sound that she turned into a cough. The guard's hand moved faster than I could track. The strike snapped across my cheekbone with a gloved backhand. My head rocked sideways. For a moment the world went white, then red at the edges. Pain flared, bright and immediate. I tasted iron where my teeth caught the inside of my lip. I did not fall. The pack helped anchor me, but I did stagger. I blinked until the corridor came back into focus. The guard's posture had not changed. He had not stepped closer or farther away. It was as if the blow had been an incidental flick of the wrist. "You do not speak, you do not question oversight. You are not clergy. You are not authorized to interpret," he hissed quietly. Around us, the technicians pretended very hard to be busy. I could feel their attention like heat on the side of my face, even though none of them looked up. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded hoarse to my own ears. "Understood." The second strike was harder in a closed fist. This time I did fall and the world came back slowly, slower than the first. The urge to say more rose in my throat and died there. My cheek burned. The guard leaned in a fraction, close enough that I could feel the cold ceramic near my skin. "You have minute value in the field, Compass," he said. "Do not waste yourself here." He stepped back and turned away, already dismissing me from his attention. To him, it had been as significant as dapping a faulty gauge. Another robed figure finished the inspection, running a scanner over my brain. "Clear," the second guard said. The first lifted his hand toward the gate chamber. "Proceed," he said. "And remember why you are permitted to leave the yard or live at all." We moved forward. It was only when we had passed through the inner arch, out of easy strike range, that Brask exhaled sharply. "What were you thinking?" he hissed under his breath, in a tone I had never heard from him before. The usual humor had been stripped out. What remained was fear, etched sharp. "I wanted to know if it could happen to me," I said. "If there was a known fault in the timers." "You wanted to question a church officer about a failure in front of his peers," Marcy said. She kept her eyes on the floor as we walked, shoulders tight. "In their eyes, that is the same as accusing him of not doing his duty." "My face remembers," I said. I touched my cheek. It throbbed. The skin was already swelling. Brask shook his head. "Do not look at them. Do not speak to them. That is what keeps us alive. You do not prod lizards you cannot see the teeth of." "I will be more careful." Marcy finally looked at me. Her gaze flicked to the reddening imprint on my cheek, then back to my eyes. "Do not mistake us," she said quietly. "We are not angry because you made him hit you. We are angry because they look at us next. The more they notice you, the more they notice the one standing beside you." There was no good answer to that. I nodded. "I am sorry," I said. "I will not draw their attention like that again." "Good," Brask muttered. I like my face unbroken. The gate hall opened ahead of us, swallowing the argument. Gate 7 waited at its far end, ring humming with a low, subsonic vibration. Technicians moved between consoles. Scripts flickered on hanging slates. The smell of ozone and old oil sat heavy in the air. The gate spun up. Light traced along the ring's engraved sigils, filling each one in sequence until the entire circle glowed. The space inside the ring clouded, turned opaque, then cleared to a glassy shimmer that did not quite reflect anything. My defunct port stingled, a mild echo of the field's charge. A light turned green. Brask rolled his shoulders once, as if settling a cloak. He glanced at me and Marcy. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Marcy said. "As I will ever be," I said. We stepped through together. Passing the threshold felt like walking through a hanging sheet of cold water. For a moment my skin crawled, and my stomach dropped as if I had missed a step on a stair. The sensation vanished as quickly as it came and I realized it wasn't a sensation correlated to a physical phenomena. We stood in a maintenance cavity carved into the inner thickness of the city's outer structure. The walls were a mix of raw stone and old concrete, laced with conduits and rusted cable runs. Broken ductwork hung from the ceiling like the ribs of some long-dead animal. The air tasted stale and dusty, with a faint underlying tang of machine lubricant. Behind us, the gate sat flush with the rock face, anchored into a frame of heavy girders. The ring's glow dimmed as we cleared the platform, leaving only the faint pulse of its idle state. Ahead, a tunnel sloped downward into darkness. "Ah," Brask said softly. "Home away from home." He sounded almost pleased. "It is exactly the same," Marcy said. Her voice was flat. I had hoped the church would have upgraded the stairs, only then did I realize it was a deadpan joke. The stairs were a misnomer. There was no simple flight here, only a series of irregular platforms and ladders welded into place decades or centuries ago, clinging to the wall like an afterthought. We had to file single, pack scraping the stone when the clearance narrowed. My pack felt heavier than it had in my cell. Each time the 33-weight mesh shifted, it dragged at my spine. The glyph stakes chimed softly where they knocked against one another, in a rhythm that made the memory of the guard's strike throb in time with my footsteps. We descended again. Dust rose with each step. It clung to my boots, my robes, and the back of my throat. Old wiring brushed my shoulders when the tunnel pinched. In some places, the stone had been carved deliberately, smooth and straight. In others, it looked like something had chewed its way through, leaving jagged edges and shattered conduit. The first time through here, I had been too overwhelmed to do anything but follow and try not to fall. This time, even with the ache in my cheek and the drag of the pack, I had bandwidth left to notice details. I flicked my ocular knob sense on in short bursts as we moved. Each ping lit up the space around us in my mind. Angles. Distances. The vertical drop we had cleared. The lateral offset of the platforms. I could feel the path lay itself down as a line of certainty behind us, slightly brighter than the unknown around it. Leaving the sense on for more than a few seconds made my temples start to throb. I learned quickly to pulse it. On for a count of 5. Off again before the pain grew. "So," Brask said, from where he led a short distance ahead. His voice bounced oddly in the confined space. "You tried to speak to a church mask and lived. This should count as a good omen." "Most people would not call a backhand a good omen," I said. "You are still breathing," he said. "This is the important part. Yes? Try not to test that too far," Marcy said from behind me. "We already have enough things trying to kill us." We reached the last ladder and climbed down into the tunnel. Stone scraped my pack. The 33-weight mesh pressed between my shoulders like a second spine. "Hold," Marcy said softly as we approached the last bend. She pushed past me to take a quick look through the gap. The shaft opened out beyond into the world outside city's wall. "Still there," she said. "The cliff did not decide to crumble in our absence. Small mercies." We stepped out onto the ledge together. The external face of the wall fell away beneath us in a staggered series of supports and jutting braces. Beyond that, the field expanse spread out, a landscape of broken machinery and strange growths under a ceiling that felt too low to be called a sky. The same harsh white light that lit the shaft burned here from holes set high in the unseen structure above. Their glare turned edges sharp and shadows very black. Massive skeletal frames of harvesters and conveyors lay ruined across the plain, half buried in drifts of gray ash and tufts of pale fungal mats. In the distance, a cluster of leaning tower husks formed a jagged horizon. The smell was a mix of cold metal, old ash, and the faint organic sweetness of decay. Somewhere far off, A machine groaned, then fell silent. I blinked and called up my memory site. The ocular nerve surge rolled through my head like a pressure front. The headache that came with it was a familiar flare, only manageable if I did not cling to it too long. A faint line appeared across the landscape, visible only to me. It traced the path we had taken during our first outing. From this ledge, across a sloping scree of debris, down between two collapsed conveyor arms, then along the side of a broken pipeway until it reached the distant patch where we had made our first camp. It looked like a quest helper arrow from an MMO. The thought made my throat tighten unexpectedly with something like nostalgia. One wasted summer on Earth, grinding levels and running raid routes in a world that had never been real. My parents had called it a phase, a distraction. They were not entirely wrong. It had been an escape. Here, the conceptual framework paid off in a way I doubted any of the church would appreciate. Lines and paths. Attention to safe angles and fallback routes. Reading environments like dungeon maps. The instincts transferred. I let the lines settle into place in my awareness, then pulsed the sense off before the pain could grow. "I do not see any fresh movement," Marcy said, scanning the plain. "Nothing obvious at least, it's clear enough." "Then we follow the old route," Brask said. His ears were perked, eyes gleaming with that restless excitement he always seemed to carry. "Let us camp at the same place tonight, yes?" There was no reason to argue. The previous site had been sheltered, with decent lines of sight and no immediate hazards. The church might have stripped it for any obvious signs of our presence after we left, but I doubted they cared enough to sanitize every wilderness camp. "Agreed," Marcy said. "Fewer surprises." "Agreed," I said. "If the terrain has shifted significantly, I will see it." We began the descent. The slope below the ledge was a mix of broken masonry and rusted machine fragments. The path my memory site had traced took us along the least treacherous lines, weaving between jagged protrusions and avoiding patches of ash that hid unstable footing. Brask went first, his claws giving him better traction on the metal. I followed his footsteps closely. Marcy came last, covering our backs. The pack dragged at my shoulders, but the familiarity of the route made it easier to ignore the discomfort. Each landmark we passed slotted into the mental map I had drawn in my cell. A toppled pipe here. A vent stack there. The twisted skeleton of a machine that might once have been a harvester, its teeth now a jagged fence. As we moved, a memory tugged at the back of my mind. That watcher in the webbing. I found myself scanning those overhead spans more often than the ground. The field expanse did not answer. Only the steady drip of some distant condensation and the occasional creak of thermal stress in ancient metal broke the silence. We reached the stretch of broken pipeway that ran parallel to the plain. Its side provided partial cover as we moved, the rusted metal rising to our shoulders on one side. The opposite view looked out over the long drop down to the lower levels, where fog and smoke obscured whatever walked there. "Feels less remarkable this time," I said quietly. "That is either growth," Marcy said, "or the first signs of dangerous numbness. I am not sure which. The first time you step outside a hab block, you think the whole world will eat you," Brask said. "The second time, you realize the world is too lazy to do it." "That is a comforting image," I said. "It is accurate," he said. We walked. By the time the previous campsite came into view, the white light had dimmed toward the superstructure's version of evening. Our camp lay beneath a slanted support strut that leaned from one broken tower husk to another, forming a rough shelter. The ground there had a slight natural depression, shielded on three sides by fallen machine parts, leaving only a narrow approach. My ocular nav line matched the place exactly. "There," I said. "Nothing about the topography seems to have shifted." "Which does not mean nothing has moved in," Marcy said. She gestured and we paused at the edge of the clearing. Brask crouched, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. I listened, letting the background noise settle. There was stillness and the soft susurration of the fungal mats moving with the artificial breeze. "It is clear enough, yes?" Brask said after a moment. "Old smells. Ours. Nothing fresh." We stepped into the camp. The remnants of our previous occupation were still there. The flattened patch where our tent had rested. The small ring of discolored ground where the heat dab had burned. A few shards of ration wrapper. A coil of discarded wire Brask had stripped from a ruined panel and then forgotten. "Efficient," Marcy said. "Half the work is already done." Brask and I reassembled the tent framework, fitting poles together and anchoring lines to the same hardpoints we had used before. The motions came easier with practice. Marcy set up the perimeter markers, placing small glyph tags at the edges of the depression, each calibrated to ping silently on her cuff if anything crossed. I considered deploying the fieldboard mesh, then decided against it for the first night. The 33 weight could serve as a secondary layer when we camped closer to suspected danger. For now, the location itself provided reasonable security. As the light overhead shifted further down its cycle, the shadows lengthened. The harsh white softened to a colder tone that hinted at night. We finished the last of the setup and settled inside the shelter, backs against the machine ribs, feet toward the tent. Brask lit a low burn heat tab in a shielded cup between us. The small disk flared once, then subsided into a steady glow that radiated gentle warmth without much smoke. Rations made their inevitable appearance. Compressed nutrient bars. Rehydrated root mash. For a while, the only sounds were chewing and the quiet clink of utensils against metal. It would have been easy to let the silence sit. We were all tired. The day had already carried more than usual weight. Marcy broke it. "You did not flinch," she said, watching the glow of the heat tab. "When the guard hit you." "I didn't really have time," I said. "I was too busy holding on to my teeth." Brask snorted, a little more of his usual humor returning now that we were away from the yard. "Most people flinch," Marcy said. "It is a reflex. You froze instead. That is not the same thing as courage." "I did not think it was," I said. "Why does it bother you?" She took a slow breath. "This life," she said, gesturing vaguely with a ration wrapper to indicate the camp, the plane, the danger, "is already too much like a monastery for my taste. Men who do not flinch when punished are exactly the sort the church tries to cultivate. They call it discipline. I do not want to see you become one of their perfect little martyrs." "You think I am that devout?" I asked. "I think you are very good at enduring things," she said with a grim face. Brask swallowed his last mouthful and wiped his fingers on a scrap of cloth. I chewed on a stale portion of bar and considered that. "I am not here because I found religion," I said. "I am here because the alternative was being killed or being dissected by Obelisk, and the church isn't doing a good job of making me want to believe, slave until death and all that." "This is not what I pictured when I thought of monastic life," Brask said. "I always imagined more candles and less fungus. More chanting. Less getting eaten by things, yes?" "Some monasteries had martial orders," I said. "Warrior monks. The history texts made them sound romantic until you looked at the casualty lists." Marcy's eyes narrow as I say that. "History texts," Marcy repeated. "The way you reference the past is strange, you know that." "How so?" I asked inwardly, gulping. "You talk about things like they are closed stories," she said. "Like you actually know things about the past. Most of us do not think that way. The past is not a set of pages you can flip back to. It is a series of incomplete notions that tell us nothing." Brask nodded. "The past is our absent father." "Yes? That is one way to put it," I said. I leaned back against the cold metal and looked up at the slanted beam overhead. "I couldn't lie here." Marcy was already suspicious. Everett's memories came in clutch, saving me from exposing more. "I grew up in a family unit," I said. "Corporate design. 2 caretakers, 1 child, all of us contracted. It was supposed to be cleaner than old families. Less emotional volatility. No one raised their voice. We were afforded access to learning systems in the Keel Authority. I was given a basic historical framework, at least one Keel thought the layman could handle. However, we did not talk about the past because it was considered inefficient." "That sounds horrible," Brask said frankly. "At the time it felt normal," I said. "I thought everyone lived that way. Quiet. Controlled. Everything is measured in productivity and compliance." "Monastic," Marcy said softly with a scowl. "I suppose," I said, thinking of it in that framework for the first time. There was a brief moment of awkward silence until I couldn't take it and spoke up, trying to make my voice sound light and joking. I wanted to get their questions off me. "What about you?" I asked, looking between them. "Is this monastic for you too? Or is this the noisy part of your life?" Marcy smiled, a small, tired curve of her mouth. Far above, one of the dwindling god rays flickered, then steadied. The sound that accompanied echoing moments after made me look up, scanning the shadows in the supporting beams. I thought of the Watcher again. The feeling in the webbing that had held still just a little too deliberately. My gaze shifted away from the group, leaving my question hanging in the air. Marcy noticed my gaze and let the question drop. "You see something?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "Just remembering." "That is not comforting," Marcy said. "I can go and poke the webs if you like," Brask offered. "No," we both said at once. He grinned. "See? You both think you are not reckless, but then you camp under the same beam twice." "There were not many better options," Marcy said. Unless you wanted to sleep out in the open and invite the whole expanse to join us. I am charming, Brask said. The monsters would like me. They would like to chew on you, I said. This is also a form of liking, he said. His mouth said it lightly, but I could see the tension easing in his shoulders. Jokes were his way of keeping the fear from turning into something sharper. I reached into my pack and pulled out the cartographic slate. How monk-like, Marcy said teasingly. Homework. I just rolled my eyes and gave a theatrical sigh. I was learning that Marcy's connection to the heretical faction wasn't. I settled the slate on my knees. The surface woke under my touch, grid lines blooming softly. I closed my eyes and pulled up the route from Gate 7 to here. The maintenance ladders. The shaft. The cliff. The slope and pipeway and camp. The ocular knob sense helped, but I kept it to a series of light pulses this time, just enough to check proportions. The path appeared in my mind as a white thread over a dark background. I translated that thread into lines on the slate, adjusting for scale as I went. Brask watched for a moment, then leaned back and closed his eyes. Wake me if something comes to eat us, he said. We will let it take one bite first, Marcy said. For humility. He chuckled and settled his head against the machine rib that we used as a tent frame, already half asleep. Marcy shifted closer to the entrance of the shelter, pistol across her knees, gaze scanning. Do you ever get tired? She asked after a while, voice low so as not to wake Brask. Of all of this? Constantly, I said. Unfortunately, the alternative seems worse. Doesn't it? Yeah, that is the problem with the way they treat us, she said. The more useful your mind or body is, the more they will hinge plans on it. That is what monasticism seems to be in practice. Finding others to carry the burden of God's will for you. I looked down at the lines on the slate. My own hand had drawn them, but the path they described was not only mine now. Brask and Marcy had walked it too. The church would eventually turn it into a piece of their machine. I am not planning to take vows, I said. Not to them. No, she said. But the church has a way of extracting vows whether you speak them out loud or not, or did you think that the Puritans all started that devout? The words called up the memory of the astrolabe in my domain. The lean of the pendulum toward yes when I had asked if trying to keep my will free was a path I could survive. The thin slice of unclear at the edge of that swing. Marcy tilted her head slightly, considering. If you ever decide the price is too high, she said quietly, tell us before you tell them. I will, I said. It was a promise I hoped I could keep. The map lines on the slate reached the camp. I added a small symbol to mark it, then let the grid dim. The slate felt heavier when I slid it back into the pack, even though I knew its mass had not changed. Above, the supports remained quiet. No web stirred. For now, it was enough. Sleep in shifts? Marcy asked. Yes, I said. I can take first watch. My head is too busy to rest yet. She nodded and nudged Brask's shoulder with the toe of her boot. Sleep, idiot, she said. You're on second. He grumbled something incoherent but did not protest. Marcy pulled her cloak tighter and slid down until her back pressed against the rib beside mine. Her eyes closed, but her hand still rested on the pistol. I adjusted my position to face the camp mouth, letting my gaze range over the shadows beyond. Somewhere out in the dark, watchers and gogs and other things moved on their own timelines. The church sat safe behind walls, reading reports and adjusting overlays on maps. My timer ticked quietly in the back of my mind, counting something I still did not fully understand. I listened to Brask's breathing settle into a slow rhythm and Marcy's softened beside him. My fingers found the edge of the silliport at my neck. The metal there was cool. Monk, I thought. Monasticism. They wanted me to be obedient and silent. Instead, I sat awake on the edge of their world, mapping routes they had not walked, planning how to keep my own vows rather than theirs. Chapter 18, Interlude, Malak Treadborn. Far away from Horos Yard, beyond its walls and the rusted plains of the field's expanse, something drifted through the void. Malak Treadborn, Mal to the few who dared shorten his name, felt the pull of that world through the hull. His massive frame heaved and sweated in the cramped hold as the drop pod drifted in its killing orbit. The pod spun silently through a cluttered sky of dead satellites and broken metal. Gravity, as far as Mal had ever understood it, belonged to Chalabia. Gravity was the pull of the red sands under his feet, the weight of a club in his hand and a rival's throat in his grip. Up here, the word meant something stranger. His bulk tugged first in one direction, then in another, as the pod slid through pre-charted paths. Invisible hands pulled at him. The moons of Chalabia, the broken body of Terra beneath them, and other masses he did not have names for, all fought over the weight of him. The navigator slaves chanted coordinates in the forward compartment, their thin voices carried through metal. Mal could not understand the words, only felt the rhythm in his chest. His sweat did not fall. It floated. Droplets broke free from his brow and shoulders and drifted in the dim blue emergency light. They bumped against the quilted plating of the bulkhead and against the armor of the ogres strapped in around him, shattering into smaller beads before they slowly evaporated into the already heavy air. It made the small compartment feel even more humid. The smell of it mixed with the oil of power armor joints and the faint chemical sting of the caloric tanks. His troopers did not complain. They clung to their restraints and stared straight ahead, eyes wide in the low light. Their tusks jutted, their mouths were pressed shut. They were too tense to speak, too aware of how far they were from any honest sand under their feet. And they were his ogres. He had personally beaten each one into perfect submission. The pod rumbled as other forces took hold. Those were not the steady tides of distant masses. Those were turns as the navigator slaves worked to navigate this boat across the void of worlds. Mal felt each adjustment as a sideways drag across his ribs. His drop cage creaked as his weight shifted against the harness. Metal dug into his shoulders and hips where the straps crossed, but he did not curse it. He had earned this seat. He had clawed his way here from the lowest rungs of the chosen peoples. Malik Treadborn, an ogre from the running camps, once fit for nothing better than slave meat or a gladiator's warm-up. The thought made the corner of his mouth twitch with rough pride. His tribe had followed Tazel Rotha across the holy world of Chalabia, and for that he was grudgingly grateful. The others were weak in many ways, but at least they had chosen to follow the best. It was only right that they had run in the wake of the greatest of the engine cities. The pod lurched. His stomach rose toward his throat and his organs seemed to slide up inside his chest. He had not felt such a helpless motion since he had been small enough to need to cling to the mothers of the tribe when the ground shook under the city's movement, or while they ran to keep up with the refuse piles, before they were picked clean. When he had been small and soft and nothing but a drain on those around him. The memory sickened him. That same helpless feeling had driven steel into his will. From the moment he had realized that he had been born into the bottom rung of the chosen of the gods, he had sworn that he would never feel that way for long. He was an ogre. A biological creation of the orcs. The high shamanery of war and progress had bred his kind in vats and womb tanks, sculpting bone and muscle for strength and bulk and labor. They had deliberately starved the parts that took to magic and quick thought, leaving ogres thick of limb and slow of mind. Perfect slaves for those few who lived in the great mobile cities. Then inevitably when ogres grew too numerous for the lower decks and maintenance pits, they were not granted more space. They were turned out left to survive on the planet's surface. The engine cities left deep scars across Chalabia. Their treads and grinding drives tore the red crust and left long, walled canyons filled with tangled debris and toxic pools. The refuse of the great cities settled into those tracks and hardened into new landscapes. That was where the ogre tribes ran. Mal had known for some time that he was different. The realization had come slowly, like the gradual awareness of a wound that did not stop bleeding. The others in the running tribe did not plan. They reacted. They charged and feasted and slept. They looked ahead only far enough to know where the next carcass or scrap of armor could be taken. They did not think about what would happen when the next dry run came, or when the city shifted course and abandoned the canyons they knew. Neither was Mal a schemer like the orcs in the stories. Cunning did not come easily to him. He could not twist words around a rival's throat in the way shamans did. What he could do, what set him apart from his tribe mates, was simple. He could think about the future as if it were a thing he could grip with both hands and move. He had realized that most ogres in his tribe would not plan more than a few hours ahead. If he forced himself to think in days and weeks, he was already stronger than they were in the places that mattered. He had trained that part of himself in the only way he understood. He practiced and pushed his body until he knew exactly where his limits lay. He learned how long he could run before slumber took him, that terrible collapse when an ogre's muscles burned out and his mind slipped away into a sleep that lasted days or weeks, a death sentence. He learned how much he could carry, how many blows he could take. He learned how to read the shifts in the city's path from the way dust moved in the distance. He took that knowledge and applied it like a solid club. By the time he had reached 15 world cycles, he had subjugated his weak tribe. He had forced them into order through beatings and contests and clear demonstrations of strength. He had become the one they followed without question, not because of a shaman's blessing, but because he had proven, over and over, that he would not fall when they did. Now, at 19 cycles, he stood nearly 3 meters tall and wore the markings of a sergeant in the recycled legion. He had led his tribe to fight the Klinger ogre tribes, those strange cousins who built rope habitats that swung and creaked from the underside of the great cities as they rumbled along. Klingers were feared among the runners. They had first claim to the scraps that fell from the cities. They could raid up and down the canyon walls. They could retreat to places the footrunners could not reach. To Mal's younger eyes, the Klinger tribes had seemed untouchable. They represented the ogres who had fought off all comers. They did not fight off Malik and his bloody footrunners. He remembered those days with a fierce glow. The dust storms. The rope ladders cut loose from above. The Klingers screaming as they fell. The way his runners had painted their feet in the blood of their enemies and how they had stamped their prints across the canyon floor as a warning. He had beamed with pride then. That had been the entire world he knew. He had subjugated those Klingers, and from the conquered he had mustered the strong. Only the ogres who could fight and cling to the swaying ropes at the same time were worth keeping. He took them into his own band. Then he did something no sane ogre was supposed to do. He looked up at Tazl itself and decided to climb. None living in the runner tribes had assaulted the walls of the cities. The stories said it could not be done. Shamans and orc warbands had guns on the parapets. The exhaust vents belched poison. The walls were sheer and slick. Mal had looked at those walls and seen footholds. He had seen vent housings and maintenance chains. He had seen paths where others only saw barriers. He took his chosen ogres and he climbed. They had gone up hand over hand with crude harnesses and scavenged ropes. They had climbed past the old rope nests of the Klinger tribes and past the points where the wind screamed against the city's hull. They had climbed through clouds of ash and sand, knuckles bleeding, muscles screaming. Some of the ogres in the drop pod with him now had made that ascent at his side. He trusted those survivors implicitly. He had seen them hold when others let go and survive things that killed all the rest. They had not reached the top in secret. The moment they had hauled themselves over the city's lower ramparts, the orcs had been waiting. Alarms had already sounded. Nets had dropped. Stun lances had discharged. Mal remembered the sting and the smell of his own flesh burning. He had woken in chains under arena lights. They had been made to fight to prove their merit against other ogre tribes who had attempted the same mad climb in generations past. The pits were full of those who had believed that reaching the city's underside was a victory. The orcs had taught them otherwise. It had been a death sport. Duel after duel and mass battle after mass battle beneath the roaring crowds of the high decks. The orcs had wagered on them as they would on any other beast. Mal had watched his numbers shrink with each match. He had taken blows that would have killed him before the climb. He had given worse in return. When the dust settled, the pits had been filled with corpses. The ones who had not died outright had been hauled away for parts, their tough muscles and bones destined for other projects. Mal and the grizzled remnants of his band had remained standing. It had earned them the greatest honor an ogre could climb for. The right to be taken into the Recycled Legion. The Recycled Legion was a force composed of ogres who would not die. They were drawn from those who would not fall in the tracks of the cities or in the arenas. They were too stubborn, too strong, or too lucky to be left in the pits. That was when his life had truly changed. The day of the rite was carved into him as deeply as any scar. He remembered standing in the chamber under the shaman's hall, the air thick with the stink of incense and hot metal. The orc bio-shamans had traced runes in blood across their chests and skulls. Mech priests had fitted metal crowns around their brows, crowns that hummed with caged power. Battle cosmopolitans, those strange orcs who had walked a dozen campaigns, had watched with knowing eyes. He remembered standing in the chamber under the shaman's hall, the air thick with the stink of incense and hot metal. The orc bio-shamans had traced runes in blood across their chests and skulls. Mech priests had fitted metal crowns around their brows, crowns that hummed with caged power and mysterious liquids. Battle cosmopolitans, those strange orcs who had walked a dozen worlds, had watched with knowing eyes. They had been bathed in a shower of blood, torrents of sacrificed life washing over them from the suspended tanks. The fluid had stung his eyes and flooded his mouth as the needles injected into his brain. It felt like drowning and burning at the same time. But when it was done, the survivors were kings amongst ogres. Not in the way of orcs, with banners and titles, but in the only currency that mattered to their kind. They had been marked as the ones who would lead others into killing grounds in return. The shamans had granted them everything an ogre could imagine needing. Almost everything. They had been given access to the holy caloric tanks, those great sealed vats that held dense, nutrient-rich slurry. The tanks had tubes that fed directly into ports in their armor and into their bodies. As long as they were properly fed, as long as the flow from the tanks remained steady, they would never fall into slumber. The old fear of their people, that sudden, terrible collapse after too much effort, would never claim them again. They had been fitted with power armor crafted by orc smiths, layered plates and actuators and servos that magnified their already monstrous strength. The armor was marked with clan sigils and city icons that Mal did not fully understand, but he respected the weight of them. They had been given barracks that alone had been paradise, a place to stop that was their own. They had routines of training, patrol, and rest that did not depend on the whims of hunger or weather. They had regular fights in the arenas, but those were now shows of strength rather than exterminations. It had been paradise for a runt from the runner tribes. The price had been hidden in the crown. The same right that had hardened their bodies and wired them into the caloric tanks had also burned out their ability to sire more ogres. The shamans have cut that possibility away without flinching. Recycled, they called them. Useful material, reshaped and put to better purpose. Mal had accepted it. He did not need children. He needed war. Time had flowed in a pattern he could live with. Guard duty on the Great Walls. Drills in the training pits. Occasional deployments to crush lesser threats in the canyons. Plenty of meat. Plenty of fight. Enough rest between. Then the call had come, with a vibration that ran through every plate and beam of Tazal Rotha. Iron Tide. No survivors. It had been more than sound. The whole city had shaken and answered with a bellow from its engines. The shamans had taken to the parapets and the priests had raised their machines in sacrifice. The words had burned in Mal's bones. War was coming to the hellscape underworld. The broken plain the shamans called Terra. Every ogre knew the stories in broad strokes. Terra was the broken plain. A place shattered in the creation of the worlds. Home to old enemies whose names tasted wrong, like ground bone. Kenoma. Others, older labels that Mal could not remember clearly. He did not know what Kenoma was. He did not know who had lived there or why it mattered to the orcs. He knew only that it was time to earn the gifts he had been given. He had already been blessed twice by the bio-shamanic orcs. Once when they had crowned him recycled, and once when they had promoted him to sergeant of his legion. His path was war. The shamans would only progress the tools that were useful along that path. He had left the paradise of the barracks and the known arenas on the holy ships that could cross the void between worlds. Mal had expected the war engines to roar across sands or to burrow through the ground. He had pictured something like a city on tracks, only faster. Instead, the ships had roared upward. He remembered standing in the launch hold, armor sealed, as the deck beneath his boots had trembled. The engines had thundered. Heat had rolled up through the metal. The weight of Chalabia's pull had become a crushing hand that pressed him into the deck. Then, suddenly, that weight had fallen away. The feeling had almost knocked the breath out of him. The world had dropped from his feet and the sky was broken. Now his team was ready in the drop pod, on approach to Terra, hell itself. They had recovered from the sickness of the first transition. They had tolerated drills in low-gravity bays. The navigator slaves, orcs spread thin and nervous for their task, kept the ship locked on target. Mal did not know the target. He did not need to know it. Orders would find him when they mattered. They always did. The pod shuddered, a deeper vibration than before. It ran through the metal of the cage and into Mal's bones. Heat built around them. He could feel it as a rise in temperature through the insulation. Things outside were burning. The hull groaned in a way that made several of his troopers' eyes flicker with brief panic. None of them understood what lay outside the shell. Mal, like them, could only picture what the shamans had told them. In his mind, they were breaking through the barriers between worlds, tearing through whatever held the Terran hellscape back from the cleaner realms. He had only ever known two worlds. Chalabia first and the idea of Terra, the massive world in the sky. He assumed there were more. He had seen the skies as a runt in the runner tribes. He remembered lying on his back in the canyon's thin shade, staring up at the tiny lights that pricked the dark. He had wondered what they were. It comforted him now to know that there was still so much left to see. So many people to subjugate. So many ways to prove his worth to the gods and the shamans above him. The pod hit thicker air. The vibration changed from a distant thrum to a wild rattle. The sudden drag shoved Mal forward against his restraints. His stomach lurched again. The ogre directly across from him clenched his jaw so hard that Mal could see the muscles jump in his neck. Warning runes lit along the ceiling. Mal did not know their codes. The navigator slaves and mech priests had drilled them to obey light patterns, not to interpret them. Green meant launch. Yellow meant prepare. Red meant brace. All the strips were red. Somewhere above, metal screamed. The sound was distant and muffled. Mal had learned to trust noises through hulls. Something in the ship's skin did not like what was happening. The sound cut off sharply as explosive bolts fired. The drop pod kicked. The sensation was different from the ship's ascent. There was no long, drawn-out push. Instead, a single violent shove punched them downward. Mal's teeth clacked together. His vision sparkled for a heartbeat. Then the world outside roared. Friction clawed at the pod's belly. Heat flared again, stronger than before. The hull around them glowed dull orange in a few seams. The impact harness dug into his chest and shoulders so hard he thought it might crack his armor. The ogre to his right bit back a curse and swallowed it. None of them spoke. Their silence was enforced, the force stuck their jaws tight. Mal let the sensations wash over him and reached back to his drills. Brace. Breathe steadily. Keep his head clear. Orders would come. Something struck the pod from the side. It was not a physical impact like rock against hull. It was a hammer of force that rippled the metal and made the entire compartment ring. Several of the drop cages swung against their pivots. One of the warning strips overhead burst into sparks. The ogre 2 seats down roared as a loose strap whipped across his face. Blood spattered the air and turned into floating beads. Mal was surprised he managed to scream. His fingers tightened on his restraints. He felt the pod begin to spin. The gravity shifts he had endured earlier had been slow and predictable, like waves rolling under a boat. This was different. This was a violent tumble. The pod rolled end over end. The sense of up and down vanished. His stomach tried to climb out through his throat. His vision narrowed. Through it all, the roar outside shifted. It took Mal a few seconds to understand that the sound was not just air. There were other noises mixed in. Deep, repeating thuds. Sudden rattling impacts against the hull. The scrape of metal fragments. He understood then. The shamans had spoken of this. Terra had teeth. Old gun towers and defense platforms ringed the broken plain. The shamans had described them as blind guardians, still firing at anything that came too close, long after their masters had turned to dust. Sky spears, the ogres called them. One of those spears had found near purchase. The pod lurched again. The spin shifted. For a brief moment, Mal could feel a direction again. Down tugged at his boots and the strap spit into his shoulders. Someone shouted in the forward compartment. The voice was high and terrified. One of the navigator slaves, losing discipline. A second impact hammered into the rear of the pod. Not a direct hit, but near enough that Mal's ears popped. The lights flickered. The hull dented inward with a shriek. The rear wall bulged, a new curve pressing toward them. The spin smoothed into a wild tumble, then into a hideous yawing corkscrew. Even Mal's trained and crowned body could not fully compensate. His vision grayed at the edges as blood tried to leave his head. He focused on his breath. In through his nose. Out through his mouth. He counted in time with the ragged thuds outside. He had known this would be dangerous. The shamans had said so. None of them had promised that the landing would be gentle. He had not expected to die before his boots touched the ground. The hull around them began to scream in earnest. The pitch rose and rose. Panels shook loose. One of the troopers' restraints failed with a snap. The ogre shot upward, slammed against the roof of his cage, and hung there, snarling in confusion, before the next jolt slammed him sideways again. Mal extended one massive arm as far as the restraint allowed and caught the trooper by the shoulder blade on the next swing. He held him there with sheer brute force, every muscle in his arm standing out under the armor. The trooper gripped back as best he could. The world outside shifted from red glow to streetlight. For a moment, through a tiny viewport a slit cut near the upper seam, Mal saw Terra. It was not a world as he understood them. It was a fractured shell. Plates of metal and stone lay stacked in impossible layers, some horizontal, some tilted at angles that no city should endure. Enormous girders jutted into the void. Patches of something like soil clung to the tops of plates, overgrown with pale, sickly growths. Between the layers, chasms dropped into blackness lit by the occasional sick green glow. Guns studded some of the ridges. Their barrels tracked slowly, firing upward at the rain of pods and wreckage. Some shots found targets. Dark silhouettes flared and vanished. Other pods streaked through Mal's limited view, flaming and spinning, their own trajectories altered by impacts. He barely had time to take that in before the pod slid sideways again. The navigator slaves were still trying to correct. Mal could feel the brief stuttering firings of whatever guidance the slaves had remained. The boat did not respond properly. It yawned instead of straightening. They had to be caught in the currents of the voids like the rushing sands in the south of Chalabia. They were no longer on the path the shamans had intended. A jagged slab of superstructure rushed toward them. It was a tilted plate of metal and cracked stone, the upper surface studded with the twisted remains of buildings and broken towers. The edge of it bristled with antenna stumps and the dead mouths of guns. Mal had only a heartbeat to register it. The pod hit. The first impact was glancing. The pod scraped along the edge of the plate, shearing metal from its side. The sound was like being inside a bell at the moment it was struck. The world went white in Mal's vision for an instant. The scrape slowed their horizontal motion and spun them in a new axis. The next plate did not receive them so kindly. They slammed into a lower shelf of superstructure, one that jutted out from the layers above like a broken jaw. The nose of the pod crumpled. Armor screamed. Bolts snapped. Mal's harness tore free of one anchor and he jerked against the remaining straps so hard he felt something in his shoulder crack. The trooper he had held ripped out of his grasp and slammed into the opposite wall. The air filled with the sound of bodies hitting metal and the roar of collapsing supports. The pod dug into the plate, plowed through a field of debris, and the plate collapsed. The pod continued its pullment through several straight layers. It hit a layer thicker than prior and finally ground to a halt against the shattered stump of an old tower. Silence hit as hard as any blow. For a few long heartbeats, Malik Treadborn could not hear anything but a dull ringing. He hung half out of his twisted harness, massive chest heaving, the taste of blood in his mouth. Emergency lights flickered, struggling to stay lit. The world had become a cramped coffin of buckled metal and groaning supports. He forced one hand to move, fingers scraping for purchase against bent plating. Orders had not reached him yet. The gods and shamans had thrown him at hell, and hell had hit back. Very well, Mal thought, as the ringing began to fade and other noises crept in from beyond the ruptured hull. He would have to climb here too. Chapter 19, Cartography Part 2. The fungal mats moved with the artificial breezes, a slow ripple that had nothing to do with thought. Every so often, my ocular knob sense nudged the back of my skull, eager to draw another line on the inside of my head. I ignored it. The headache was already a tight band behind my eyes. I had enough of the route down. The rest could wait for daylight. I checked the bar out of reflex. 40%. Timer steady. No new text in the periphery of my vision. No glyphs. No whispers. The part of my brain that had grown up on Earth diagnostics could not stop thinking about tumors. An unplanned gland in the brain on Earth, you took that seriously. On Earth, you booked an imaging scan and started worrying about chemotherapy. The sense was useful. There was no denying it. I could feel the map of our route like a hell breath. If I concentrated, I knew exactly how long it would take to reach Gate 7 at a walk, at a jog, or at a dead run. Terra, as the sermons called this broken plain, was a world of advantages. The strong exploited them. The weak were part of the terrain. I shifted my weight, feeling the cold through the soles of my boots, and rolled the knucklebone-sized puck between my fingers. Its slow vibration counted the watch in a language of pulses that was already becoming familiar. I realized I did not need it. My sense of time had sharpened alongside the spatial mapping. I knew to the minute how long I had been awake. When the puck buzzed at my palm to signal the change, it felt almost redundant. I pushed myself to my feet and crossed the few steps to where Brask lay. He snored softly, everything about him loose and careless in sleep. It would have been easy to believe he was not afraid of anything. I nudged his boot with my own. "Brask," I said quietly. "Your shift." He jerked awake at once, eyes snapping open. Being what he was, there was no real transition. 1 second, he was asleep. The next, his hand was already halfway to his coil pistol before he recognized me. "Monk," he muttered, lowering his hand. "You could be gentler." "I could," I said. "You still need to wake up." He snorted, pushed himself upright with a stretch that made his armor creak, and rubbed his face with both hands. "Anything interesting?" he asked, voice low. I just shook my head tiredly. He squinted into the dark beyond the tent line. "It will care when my watch begins," he said. "Everything always comes during my shift." "Consider it a sign of favor," I said dryly. He grinned at that, the expression flashing briefly in the pitch dark. "I will shout if the world ends," he said. "Go sleep. You look like you are thinking too much." "That is not going to stop because I close my eyes," I said. "But I will try." I glanced once more toward the web passage above our shelter. The strands of filament hung in draped layers from the beams. In the dim, they looked inert. My danger sense did not ping. No wet pulse in the back of my skull. No tightening in my chest. If something watched from there, it did so quietly enough that the Crown did not consider it worth a warning. That should have reassured me. It did not. I ducked into the tent. The air inside was warmer. Brask and Marcy had turned it into a small reservoir of heat simply by existing in it for a few hours. The fabric held that warmth stubbornly. My body registered the difference at once. My robes scratched where the seams rubbed my skin, but the roughness had become familiar. The smell of them was a mix of metal, sweat, and the faint chemical tang of the Horace Yard laundry. They had molded themselves around my movements over the last weeks. I could not decide if that comfort was a win or a warning. I stretched out on the floor, tugged the outer layer of the robe closer around my chest, and let my head rest on the bundled pack. The cartographic slate inside gave the pillow a hard edge. It felt appropriate. I listened to the slow rhythm of Marcy's breathing beside me. Her hand still rested on her pistol even in sleep. It was an oddly reassuring sight. If something did come through the webs, I doubted it would get all three of us before someone made it pay. The Crown's presence hummed faintly at the back of my awareness, like a machine idling on a lower deck. For a few long breaths, I lay there and argued with myself about whether getting used to the coarse fabric of church robes counted as another symptom of Stockholm Syndrome. Eventually, exhaustion did what philosophy could not. My eyelids grew heavy. My thoughts lost their edges. The warmth and the dark folded over me. I slipped into sleep. For a moment, there were dreams. The throne room in my domain rose around me in familiar fog and black stone. The astrolabe hung over the table, its nested rings quietly turning. Lines of light ran along its edges, mapping paths I could not read. Severance sat chained to his stone seat, eyes open and unblinking, the sigils in his restraints pulsing in time with something I could not hear. The pendulum arm of the astrolabe began to swing. It moved over a spread of inscribed sectors, past yes, past no, past maybe, hovering for a breath over unclear. Then the whole domain shook. The vibration tore the dream apart. I woke to the sound of barking explosions and Brask's bulk slamming through the tent flap. The world had turned into noise. I came up from sleep on pure reflex, muscles already trying to drag me upright before my mind caught up. The tent shuddered as if something immense had struck the supports above. Dust sifted down through the seams. Up, Brask bellowed. Up, up, up. Marcy was already moving. She rolled to her feet in one contained motion, pistol in hand, eyes wide and sharp. "What is it?" she snapped. "Guns," Brask said. His voice shook in a way I had never heard. "Many guns." The sound resolved as I forced myself properly awake. It was not a single blast. It was hundreds of individual reports, stacked on each other in layers. The nearest felt like distant thunder, a deeper note that rattled through the superstructure. The rest created a constant crackling barrage, as if the sky itself were firing. The barrage went on and on, each volley chasing the previous one, no pauses to reload, no breaks to breathe. I scrambled out of the tent behind them, nearly tangling in my own robe. The cold air hit my face like a slap. The camp around us was the same rough shelter as before, but it felt different with that sound pouring through it. Above us, the ceiling of the world burned. We could not see the true surface. The field expanse lay under layers of plates and beams. Somewhere up there, past hundreds of meters of stacked wreckage and superstructure, the build layer took the brunt of whatever storm raged. We saw only the results. Flashes of light speared down through narrow gaps between plates, turning dust into brief clouds of gold before they vanished. The beams overhead vibrated, sending showers of grit down in intermittent falls. The fungal mats around the camp quivered with each deeper concussion. The air itself seemed to buzz in my lungs. My danger sense triggered so hard it felt like someone had jammed a live cable into the base of my skull. A wet pulse spread outward through my head, not once, but over and over, again and again. It did not come from a single direction. It came from above, from the left, from the right, even from deep beneath our feet as the echoes traveled through the strata. Danger sense, external impact vectors. Lethality high. The information flashed at the edge of my awareness, stripped of comfort. The first thing that made sense in the chaos was a streak of orange light. It cut across the darkness above the field expanse like a burning spear, leaving a trail of sparks and shedding fragments that tumbled in its wake. For a second, it was almost beautiful. Then it slammed into a distant section of crust with an impact that made the ground under my boots heave. The sound arrived a heartbeat after the flash. A deep, brutal crack, followed by the groan of shifting metal and the brittle cascade of stone giving way. I staggered. Brask caught my arm to steady me. Another streak followed. Then another. Soon the sky above the expanse was laced with them, burning arcs punching down through the gaps in the layers, slamming into visible plates and hidden depths alike. They were not meteorites. Not natural debris. The fall was too controlled. The clusters came in waves. Some streaks flared brighter, as if driving themselves hard against resistance before they broke through. The shells hit the strata in a wide radius around us. Some impacts punched straight through a plate and vanished into the maze below. Others cratered the surface, sending up geysers of shattered metal and dust that hung in the air like ghosts. The noise made it almost impossible to think. I found myself yelling just to hear my own voice. "We need to go," I shouted, turning toward the others. "We need to get back to the gate. Now." Marcy had taken cover by the support rib, using it as a brace as she scanned the horizon. Her eyes were very narrow. Her jaw was tight. Brask looked from the falling fire to me, face pale under his fur. "Go where?" he shouted back. "Up the slope into that?" He pointed toward the ledge we had descended from. The line of our original route seemed absurdly fragile now, a thin path on a surface being perforated at random. Another impact struck somewhere behind the ledge. A section of distant wall slumped inward, shedding a sheet of debris like a slow avalanche. The crash reached us a moment later, followed by a tremor that rattled our teeth. My danger sense fired again. Each streak in the sky brought a fresh spike, as if a needle were being pushed in from multiple angles at once. It was like trying to navigate in a room where every object was a knife. "We cannot stay here," I said. I could hear the edge of panic in my own voice and hated it. If one of those hits the supports above us, we are finished. We have no idea what is coming down with them. We are in the open. We are under cover, Marcy said sharply. That is the point of choosing a hollow. We are less likely to be hit directly here than on the slope. If the plate above us collapses, the cover will not matter, I said. She flinched as another impact tore a chunk out of the distant superstructure. For a moment, the night was full of dust and burning fragments. Probabilities. My brain tried to calculate them despite itself. Surface area. Overhead structure. Angle of incoming projectiles. The unknown distribution of targets. The Crown had already done that math in its own way. The repeated pulses of danger were not subtle. "Hold, Monk, it is just panic, yes?" "It is not just panic," I said. "My Crown is screaming. Every single one of those is lethal radius on impact. The sense is not local. It does not know which one will hit us first. It just knows that the field is full." Brask bared his teeth, not in a smile. "We are not deaf," he said. "We can hear that the field is full." Another streak came in low, dragging a longer tail of fire. It skimmed the top of a nearby tower husk, shearing off the top third of it, then ricocheted into the lower levels, leaving a glowing wound in the side of a plate. The ground shuddered badly enough that I braced myself against the tent supports. "We need to go back," I said again. "We report this. We reschedule the assignment. The church did not tell us there would be a war overhead." Marcy's eyes flicked to me. In that look, I saw more than the immediate fear. I saw the calculation of what awaited us if we turned back early. "And if we walk into Gate 7 with nothing but fear and a story about falling fire?" she asked. "What then? Do you think Lenandris will pat your head and say thank you for returning before anything interesting happened?" "Interesting," I repeated, incredulous. "This is not a minor anomaly. This is a bombardment. Someone is dropping ordnance or bodies or both onto Parthosia. That changes everything about the risk profile out here. It also changes their hunger for data," Marcy said. "You think they will want us inside the walls where we might talk about what we saw without filters? Or out here where they can ask for maps of the damage?" Brask's ears flattened. "She is right about that part," he said reluctantly. "If we return too soon, we will be pulled into purity circles and question pits. They will ask why we did not trust their plans. They will say that wild things happen beyond the walls, and that is why they send us instead of going themselves." Another cluster of streaks tore across the sky, close enough that for a second the camp was etched in sharp relief. My danger sense kicked again, harder. I pressed my fingers against my temple, as if I could steady the gland physically. "This is not normal wild," I said. "This is like artillery. Maybe orbital, if this place still obeys that kind of physics. You cannot tell me that the church would treat this as a routine weather pattern." Brask shifted his weight restlessly, claws digging into the packed ground. "I do not like any of this," he said. "I would rather fight gogs than invisible guns. Then we minimize the risk that we are here when one of those guns decides to pay attention to our little plate," I said. "How?" Marcy asked. "Back along the slope under open sky, with streaks falling? Or deeper into the maze, where we have no idea what has been knocked loose?" She was not being stubborn for the sake of it. I could see the logic she clung to. Staying put meant fewer variables. Moving meant exposing ourselves to trajectories we could not predict. My mind raced. My danger sense kept flaring, which did not help. "Give me a second," I said, more to myself than to them. I closed my eyes, very briefly, and let the ocular knob connection flare. The cold, wet sensation surged through my head, overlaying the physical world with a faint wireframe map simulating my assumptions about the world around us. I saw our depression as a bowl, the slanted beam above, the plates around us. More importantly, I felt the stress lines in the superstructure as the impacts rippled through it. Each new strike registered as a jolt that lit certain lines brighter. Some shock waves dissipated quickly. Others ran along beams and plates, traveling long distances before they faded. I had to assume we were not under the direct path of the majority. The plates directly overhead took some strain, but the worst of the force bled off along supports to either side. I pushed the sense further, tasting the cost immediately. Pain lanced behind my eyes. Nausea coiled in my gut. The slope up to the ledge lit differently. It exposed a wider profile to the sky, but the plates there were thicker, designed to take more weight. The stress arcs from impacts tended to skip over the steepest faces and crash into flatter shelves. The deep maze below was worse. Shock lines bounced between narrow gaps and confined spaces like trapped bullets. Anything there when a plate took a hit would be cooked by reflected force. I let the sense snap off and sucked in a breath. "What?" Marcy demanded. "Tell me you did not just hurt yourself." "I am fine," I lied. "Listen." I spoke quickly before the afterimage of the theoretical map could fade. "Up the slope is exposed to direct fire, but the structure there is most likely stronger. If we move now, while the worst of the barrage is still overhead, we are gambling that nothing decides to target the specific meter of plate we are on. If we go down into the tight spaces, the shock waves will kill us if anything hits nearby. Their reflections will have nowhere to dissipate. That leaves two options. Stay, Brask said. Or move laterally, I said. Find another hollow like this one that sits in a pocket of lower stress. There were at least two on the way here. The one with the squashed harvester frame, and the crevice near the vent stack. You think those will be safer? Marcy asked. I did not have time to answer as another impact hit, closer this time. Dust rained down. A few thin cracks appeared in the plate beyond our shelter's edge, radiating outward like a spider's web. My danger sense reacted differently to that one. The pulse had a sharp rising edge, a sense of something focused rather than diffused. I did not like it at all. "Everett," Marcy said. Her voice was calm. That was not reassuring. "There is a third option." "What?" I asked. "We record everything we can from here," she said. "We ride it out. Then we go deeper as ordered, taking note of every new crater and structural failure, and we return with a map that makes the archivists weep with joy. They get data. We get to keep our reputations as useful tools rather than cowardly ones. That assumes we survive the ride," I said. "That assumes we survive anything," she countered. "There is no safe option in this. There is only the choice between risking death out here or risking something worse in there." She jerked her chin in the direction of Horus Yard, as if the walls themselves could loom through the superstructure. Brask gave a humorless laugh. "We is more afraid of disciplinary action than of falling fire," he said. I considered for a heartbeat as another streak slammed into a distant plate. I ran a hand through my hair, which accomplished nothing except to dislodge a fresh sprinkle of dust. "All right," I said. The word tasted like compromise and failure at the same time. "We do not sprint blind for the gate. You are right that it would look like panic and would probably kill us on the way. We also do not sit here and pretend that this is just another quirk of the wilds." Marcy's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting then?" she asked. "We treat this as part of the assignment," I said. "We observe. We record. We use my crown for what it was supposedly for. If anyone in Horus Yard can make sense of the patterns, it is the archivists and whatever priest they serve. We give them patterns. But we adjust our route to minimize the time we spend under stressed plates. When the barrage thins, we shift laterally to a better pocket." Brask gave me a sideways look. "It is that or I start walking toward Gate 7 and you can explain to Lenandris why you let the compass leave," I said. A fresh wave of streaks raked the distant sky. This volley seemed more concentrated, slamming again and again into a particular band of the strata. In the brief flares, I saw something new. One of the falling objects was closer than the rest. It cut across our section of the expanse, too low, trailing a broken arc of sparks. It clipped a hanging section of girder, sheared off a chunk of it, then vanished into the depths below with a scream of tortured metal. A second, larger mass followed. Its angle was shallower. It hit a plate not far from us with a grinding impact that hurled shards of debris into the air. The shockwave rolled over our camp like a physical blow. I dropped to one knee without choosing to. My danger sense flared, but under the chaotic warning there was a different note. A subtle tug. I blinked, hard hammering, and looked toward the impact site. Through gaps in the machinery and supports, I saw a new wound in the strata. A jagged crater had opened in a shelf perhaps a kilometer away, its edges still glowing faintly. Something dark and angular protruded from its center, half embedded in the broken metal. The crown in my head shifted. The feeling was not the generalized alarm it had blasted at me since the barrage began. This was specific. Focused. It felt unnervingly like the moment the astrolabe's pendulum had leaned toward us. A directional thread drew itself through my awareness, connecting our camp to the distant crater. My bar ticked upward to 42%. I did not like that coincidence. "Everett," Marcy said sharply. "What?" I realized I had grabbed my own bioport with one hand, fingers digging into the metal ring at the base of my neck. "There," I said. My voice came out hoarse. I forced it steadier. "Do you see that impact site? The one with the protrusion in the center?" Brask squinted in the indicated direction. His night vision was better than mine. He made a low sound in his throat. "I see something," he said. "It is not just rock." "No," I said. "It is not." The crown pulsed again, a muted echo of the earlier overload, but tuned to a single point. "I think," I said slowly, "that whatever just fell out of the sky there is something my crown cares about." "Cares in what way?" Marcy demanded. "As a threat? As a prize?" "I do not know yet," I said. "But the compass path is pointing at it whether I want it to or not." Brask's grin came back in a pale, strained version of itself. "Well," he said. "At least this means the church will not accuse us of coming back with nothing." Marcy gave me a long, measuring look, as if weighing the invisible line that tugged at my skull against the very visible fire in the sky. "Then our map just gained a new landmark," she said. "And our assignment gained a new risk." The guns above continued to bark. The debris continued to fall. The field expanse shifted under that rain of metal and purpose. I swallowed, feeling the crown's quiet insistence like a hook behind my eyes. "We wait out the worst of it," I said. "Then we go and see what fell into our world." The words settled between us, heavy as any vow. Outside our shallow shelter, Parthosia burned and tore itself open, dropping burning metal into the dark. We waited out the firestorm in the dark. Once the immediate spike of panic eased and I stopped trying to count every individual impact, my danger sense settled. It did not vanish. It receded into a manageable hum at the edge of my awareness, like a distant alarm heard through several walls. Brask and Marcy had survived the church longer than I had. If this kind of thing did not make them immediately keen to run for the gate, I had to assume it was either not entirely new or not entirely survivable by running. That thought was not comforting, but it helped me sit down. We huddled near the mouth of the shelter, backs against the machine rib, watching the sky burn through the gaps in the superstructure. The guns above us, however far away they were in actual distance, did not let up. Their rhythm shifted in waves, sometimes overlapping in an uneven roar, sometimes falling into a rolling pattern that felt almost like some kind of artillery chant. It was loud, but not a constant wall of sound. There were micro-pauses as batteries cycled. Enough space between volleys for my brain to keep trying to make sense of them, which was its own kind of torment. Once I accepted that death was everywhere, the barrage took on a strange, terrible beauty. I had seen fireworks on Earth. City displays. Controlled explosions shot up from barges on rivers or from sealed launch tubes on rooftops. You stood there with a crowd and craned your neck while colored fire blossomed against a safe, empty sky. This was like that, if the fireworks were shells and the empty sky was a ceiling made of layered metal and stone, some of which might decide to come down on your head at any moment. Streaks of flame slashed across the gaps above the field expanse. Some burned all the way through my limited view, carving lines from one horizon to another. Others cut short and disappeared deeper into the stacked strata, their light snuffed when they met something denser than air. Every impact sent a physical jolt through the plates. Dust drifted steadily from the beams overhead, turning the air near our camp into a thin, gray haze. "I have definitely had worse evenings," Brask said at one point, voice pitched low, claws drawn in close so his hand did not shake. "But this one is trying." "That is not helping," Marcy muttered. "I am making observations," he said. "Observe more quietly," she replied. I barely heard them. My mind was somewhere between the burning sky and Horace Yard's library. I wanted a clean record. Something beyond sermons and field handbooks and heavily redacted histories. I wanted context for this patchwork world that pretended to be a planet. I wanted to know whether this kind of bombardment had a name, whether it was rare, whether it marked the beginning of something or the tail end of a cycle. Every time I had gone looking for answers so far, I had run into someone else's dogma. The church layered everything in theology. Horace Yard's archivists might have a genuine data buried under the sermons, but their access was controlled by people whose first instinct was to lie by omission. On Earth, I would have gone to a database. A peer-reviewed archive. Failing that, the uncurated sludge of the wider net. At least then I could triangulate between competing propaganda. Here, The only major information source I knew was Obelisk Systems, and they had already tried to kill me, and with more information I don't think Obelisk or Keel are any better than the Church. I had more contacts than Brask and Marcy. I knew about the converted saints and English, but if they had any secrets, they were keeping them exactly where I kept mine, very close, behind whatever expressions helped them move through the day. I could not blame them. I still needed more. The idea came like a line connecting 2 points I had not realized were on the same map. I finally had an avenue of information gathering that was almost outside Church control. It was still inside someone's control. Severance was a zealot. His faction had its own propaganda. They were a minor player as far as I understood the wider war, but that might have been exactly why his perspective mattered. Underdogs noticed things larger powers tried to ignore. The conversation and my peers' reaction to the raining fire had clicked something in my thoughts. Watching them choose measured fear over instinctive flight made it clear that waiting for the Church to spoon-feed me context was pointless. If I did not use the powers they had twisted into me, I would not be around long enough for them to discover that I had them. I stood up so suddenly that Brask flinched. I think. My voice came out rough. I swallowed and tried again. I think I have an idea on how we could get some context. Marcy looked at me sharply. What kind of idea? The kind I cannot explain, I said. Not fully. Not yet. Only you cannot tell anyone or ask me how I know, if it works. Brask's ears tilted. He stared at me for a beat, then huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh. This is not suspicious at all, he said. Marcy opened her mouth to protest. Brask, she began. It is fine, he said, cutting her off gently. Sometimes doing something, even if it will not work, is the right thing to do, yes? Better than sitting and letting the fire fall on our heads. She pressed her lips together, clearly unhappy. If this gets us killed, I will haunt you. I already see you in my dreams, he said. One more ghost will not matter. He said it lightly, but there was something in his eyes that made me wonder what his dreams actually looked like. I did not wait for them to argue more. I turned and ducked into the tent, pulling the flap down behind me. The sound of the bombardment dampened a little with the layer of fabric between me and the open expanse, but it did not vanish. The vibrations came through the ground and through the frame of the shelter. My bedroll jumped slightly with each close impact. Setting up the domain ritual here, under a sky full of falling metal, felt like a particularly bad idea. My hands shook as I cleared enough space on the floor. I told myself it was from the adrenaline and the cold. The truth was that part of me was still that lab rat who knew that every unexplained symptom might be the start of something terminal. I unfolded the cloth with the geometric pattern I had worked into it over the past night. The lines were a simplified version of the sigils that bound my domain. I laid it flat and smoothed the wrinkles with my fingertips. The coiled pistol sat at the edge of my reach. The cartographic slate lay where I had left it in the pack. I ignored both. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, then pressed a few drops into the central circle of the pattern. The red spread along the cloth's threads in a slow, almost lazy motion, following the lines I had drawn, then veering off as if it had found its own preference. My danger sense flared once as the domain threshold opened. For a moment, the tent stretched around me. The fabric walls seemed to recede. The sense of vibration from the outside world faded. The air took on a thick, humid quality, heavy with the copper tang of my own blood. Then the red mist rose. It poured up from the cloth in a smooth column, not exploding the way it had in previous, uncontrolled entries. The mist climbed higher than the tent should have allowed and then folded in on itself, swallowing the canvas and the field and the roaring sky beyond. My ears popped. The noise of the bombardment cut off like someone had hit mute. An immense relief washed through me as the familiar shape of the domain settled into place. The throne hall was as I had last left it. Black stone floor. Red fog coiling along the edges. The long table stretched out before the throne, its surface carved with divination lines and old symbols that meant more to the crown than they did to me. The astrolabe hovered above the far end of the table, nested rings turning slowly. Its pendulum arm hung still for now, as if waiting. Severance's stone chair stood to my right a few spots down from the throne, slightly lower than the throne but unmistakably part of the arrangement. Chains still wrapped its arms and legs, studded with sigils. They were slack now, not pulling tight as they had when he had first been dragged here. I could see his connection to the domain. It was not a visible cord, nothing so literal. It appeared to my inner sense as a line of pressure, a vector of attention that ran from the center of the chair back into the depths of the mist. The line pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I hoped, absurdly, that whatever he was doing right now in his own world was not important or physically dangerous. I had no idea what happened to someone's body when their mind was pulled into a domain construct. That, more than anything, made me feel like exactly the kind of tyrant the church would have loved to cultivate. I mounted the steps to the throne and sat. The stone was cold under me. The position felt wrong and right at the same time. My friends from Earth always joked that I was too self-conscious. I tried, for once, to put that aside. I thought of that role of Tybalt and every disillusioned tyrant I had ever seen in fiction. Men who had realized the system was a game and lives were a pawn. I allowed myself the air of aloof, bored authority that they had worn. Not because I believed it, but because Severance did. Then I reached for the connection. It responded at once. Pulling on it felt like hauling a chain through my own skull. There was resistance. Not in the sense of someone fighting me, but in the sense of dragging something through layers of medium that were not designed to be parted. The red mist thickened around the chair. This time, Severance's arrival was less bloody. There was still trauma in the way reality flexed, but the domain handled it more cleanly. It was like watching a heavy stone dropped into a slow river of fog. The mist bulged around an invisible weight, then broke outward in concentric ripples. With a final surge, Severance was there. He appeared seated, as if he had been forced down into the chair mid-stride. His eyes were wide, pupils blown. He looked around frantically, head turning from one side of the hall to the other, trying to understand why his senses had been ripped away from whatever he had been focusing on. The chains coiled up around his wrists and ankles, not tightening to the point of pain, but making their presence clear. The sigils along them pulsed once, acknowledging the connection. He swallowed and glanced down at his shackled hands, then back up at me. The chains that held him were slack rather than biting, but he did not test them. Every trace of his body language said that he understood they were secondary to the will that had placed him here. For a moment, I saw the exact second when he realized that time was stopped behind his eyes. The frantic motion in his gaze stilled. His breathing, which had been ragged, shifted into something more controlled. The mental image was real to him. The domain existed as more than a dream. "Hello, Severance," I said. My voice carried easily in the hall. There was no competing noise. The external world's firestorm remained outside. Severance turned his head toward me. He looked different than he had the first time. Not physically, his face still bore the same gaunt lines, the same hollowed cheeks, the same inked markings that traced along his jawbones and across his brow. His eyes were still too bright, the pupils ringed with a faint red. What had changed was his understanding. "Sacred One, Lord Fetus," he said, voice low. He swallowed and glanced down at his own shackled hands, then back at me. "You pulled," he said. I felt the world tear. Where am I again? The throne between. The red hall. I let a heartbeat pass, deliberately slow, and leaned back in the throne as if it had always belonged to me. "You are where you were made to kneel," I said. "The place in the pleroma that answers to my attention. When I am bored, I shape it. When I am curious, I open it." His shoulders hunched a fraction at the word bored. It was a reaction I had hoped for. Playing God was easier than I wanted to admit. All I had to do was give my existing arrogance a costume. "You are above the triumvirate," he said. He pronounced their title with a ritual precision that carried years of contempt. I knew it, felt it for the first time before. And yet I doubted. The Archons do not pull like this. "Forgive my transgression if you deign me worthy, it will not happen again. Punish me however you see fit." His voice trembled. He sounded almost pleased by that thought. I had to stop myself from answering the first way that came to mind, which was to say that I was very much not above anything and that most days I felt like someone who had fallen down the stairs of three worlds at once. Instead I let my expression stay calm and a little tired. "The Archons are small," I said. "They are puppets that forgot the strings that still control them. Your ascendancy to my halls of such heights interests me, you and your kind are a curiosity." His eyes widened slightly, as if I had just confirmed some private suspicion. "You watch us," he said. "You watch a humble Severance. The Keel Authority says the higher shapes do not care about the heretics. They say you must only look at the triumvirate and their corporate gods." "They say many things," I replied. "Most of those things are prayers about themselves. I watch what entertains me. I watch what might threaten me. At the moment, that includes you. It also includes what is happening under us." His gaze flicked upward toward the unseen layers of metal and stone beyond the red mist, then back to me. "You feel it," he said. "Even here?" The question was testing. "I see the plains shiver," I said. "I feel tiny guns chewing holes in the skin of this broken plain. I see shells or pods or bodies falling in patterns that do not belong to the broken semblance you call the natural order. I have no patience for their quarrels about destiny. But you call it a whim or a fancy. My interest is piqued and so I desire context, to understand you. I let my eyes rest on him in a way that I hoped read as expectant rather than pleading. So, I said. Tell me why those little bugs blink with their tiny lives? Severance. Inwardly I cringed but I hoped the tone was right. The words I had used just barely hinted enough to lead him to the topic I wanted. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself. It was clear he still even now needed a moment to accept the idea that something above the triumvirate had taken an interest and that this interest required information instead of worship. It is the Iron Rain, he said. The name fit the sound that still echoed in my bones from the outside. Start earlier, I said. Understand I chose not to listen to the squabbles of the insects beneath me. Until you. He gave a small, involuntary smile at that image. It was the expression of a starving man shown a pantry. As you wish, he said. His shoulders sank into the stone of the chair in a posture that was almost a bow. Forgive the presumption, Sacred One. I forget that what shakes us does not even stir you unless you decide to look. I did not correct him. Then make it worth my attention, I said. Yes. His agreement came out almost as a whisper. Yes. Of course. The Iron Rain, then, from the beginning. He wet his lips, eyes never quite leaving my face. The guns you feel, he said, are the keel guns. All of the keel-constructed hives were wrapped with guns when it first carved a seat into the crust. Layers of old metal and newer intent. They are still keels, even if the current clerks in authority offices pretend they are too old to understand. He let out a soft, contemptuous breath at the word authority, then schooled his expression again, as if he remembered who he was performing for. The guns do not fire often, he continued. Their maintenance is costly. Their operators are a closed guild under keel, one with some power known as the Teeth of Terra. When they speak, it is because someone above has come close enough to harm the city, or close enough to tempt it. Above, I echoed. Define above. Chalabia, he said without hesitation. The moon world. The domain of the orc tribes. Their shamans and their false gods that ride in the skins of machines. They muster for war while they dream of carving a direct vein into old Kenoma and bleeding it dry. Every few cycles, they test Keel's patience. He smiled again, the expression thin and sour. And Keel answers with the guns, he said. That is the war you hear. The Iron Rain is the army the orcs thrown down onto Terra. The picture he painted began to unveil some of the world outside of the church. And the triumvirate, I asked. Where do they stand in this little disagreement? He stiffened at the title, then forced himself to relax. The three watch, he said carefully. As they always do, only Keel's head, the trifold prophet of weeping mess, has their ear in this era. His face looked scorned and hurt as he admitted it. They write outcomes in ledgers none of us see. We of the harp of human hands pray to the three, until recently. The harp of human hands, I said. Your little choir? I asked while disinterestedly picked at my nails. He brightened at the acknowledgement. Yes, Sacred One, he said quickly. His voice caught on the first word and he flinched at the sound of it. He ducked his head so low his chains kissed the floor. We are very small. Very low. A little obedience, tucked under bigger ledgers. In the memos they call us a cult, a risk vector, a subject-gated devotional cell. He swallowed, Adam's apple jerking, and dared a flicker of eye contact before staring back at my feet. We file the forms they give us, we smile, we nod, he went on, the words coming in little rushes. On paper we serve the Keel authority. In truth we name ourselves a chorus. The chorus of severance. His shackles rattled as he lifted his hands a few centimeters, as if to show they were empty. Severance is the goal, he said, softer. I took the name so the goal would have a throat and a spine. We teach that the world is a harp held in a dead hand. Cut the hand, and the harp becomes divine once more. That is our saying when we are alone. He licked dry lips. Out loud we invoke in the names of the three so the auditors sleep, he said, but in the tight spaces between words we call a fourth name, my name. We play the strands between flesh and contract. We bind the scraps they throw away. We listen where their censors do not reach, and we are very grateful for every corner they forget to watch. He winced, as if he had said too much, and then hurried to make it seem like a gift rather than a slip. It is because we listen that I can speak, he added quickly. We have ears near Keel's gun crews. He said it with an almost painful eagerness, like a man pushing an offering forward and hoping not to see it brushed aside. You are confused, I said, letting myself sound faintly amused. You do not understand why something above the triumvirate would care which city's guns are barking. He flinched, caught. I would never presume to judge your interests, he said at once. Only, it is rare to be noticed from above. You are not in their catechisms. None of our diagrams place a throne where you sit. That you ask about Keel and Chalabia at all means that either my fears have reached your table, or my faction has. You assume it is about your fears, I said. It is about you. His eyes widened at that. The harp of human hands, I went on, is a trivial structure. Loyal enough to pray, disloyal enough to listen, however you cut interesting patterns in the noise. You are an anomaly, think you came bursting into my world with the violence of birth, that makes you entertaining. He swallowed. I live to entertain, he said, and I believe that he meant it. Then entertain me properly, I said. I let a hint of indulgence into my voice, as if I were humoring a pet idea. Tell me how this iron rain touches your little chorus first, and only then how it disturbs the plates where because of you my glance happens to rest. His breath caught. I watched him rearrange his thoughts around that small admission, the idea that my attention had already chosen a patch of ground. Yes, sacred one, he said. Gladly. He leaned forward as far as the chains allowed, which was not much. The movement still made the shackles ring softly against the stone of the chair. For us, he said, the iron rain is hunger and hope together. When Chalabia flings its soldiers and war forms down the well, the first thing we feel is fear. Their guns are heavy. Their shamans do not care where their fire lands. They would crack a hive to dust if it meant scoring the right mark. The second thing we feel is appetite. For the soldiers? I asked. A devious smile across my face. He shook his head at once. The meat is an afterthought, he said. We are not the civic cults. We do not fight over bodies. We hunt their tools. Their alloys. Their glyph metal. The orcs build in ways our engineers do not understand. They print whole circuits into bone and plate. Their shamans persuade minor things from dark places to live inside the seams of their armor. Every pod that falls intact is a treasure chest if you are willing to bleed for it. And if you are not, I said. Then you stay in your alcoves and let Keel and the frontline faiths fight over the wreckage, he said. They will strip the obvious pieces, drag the survivors into interrogation pits, and file reports about contamination and valor. We read those reports later. It is useful, but slow. Better is when one of ours reaches the crater first. He said ours with a pride that sat oddly beside his groveling. You send people under the iron rain, I said laughing with outward bloodlust. Inwardly it shocked me to hear and I had to confirm. Into the impact bands. If we can, he said. Not everywhere. We are small. We pick our chances. If the guns favor a direction, we listen. If telemetry leaks from the teeth of Terra, we listen harder. Wherever we think pods will fall between Keel and the deeper plates, we send watchers. Sometimes they find nothing but slag and yet sometimes they find a hull that bounced, or a suit that walked away. Hide, he said immediately. We do not fight war forms head-on. We let the city soldiers and civic zealots soften them. We watch from tunnels and vents and broken maintenance ways. When everyone else has killed each other over the right to call it a victory, we crawl into the cracks and take whatever still hums. He said it with the tired confidence of someone who had rehearsed that pattern many times. You do not bother with the wounded, I said. He gave a small, humorless smile. The wounded shout, he said. They call for extraction. They call on their false gods. They call on their officers. They attract attention. We are not interested in attention. We require quiet, dead things speak least. The way he said it made the hairs at the back of my neck stir. You strip their toys, I said. You bottle their ghosts. You leave the screaming to the civic flocks. I see the pattern. He swallowed as if the approval itself were a kind of food. Yes, sacred one, he said. That is our work. We stack the fallen years. We hoard the offcuts. Stack how? I asked, as if the question barely interested me. Your little chorus scrapes metal and bone out of craters. What then? Do you make shrines? Do you eat it? Explain why I should not find this dull. His relief at being allowed to speak was almost embarrassing. We catalog, he said quickly. We bind. We distill. The artifacts go to vaults that the Keel Authority does not know exist. Not yet. We have chambers carved into old logistics decks, forgotten during the last 3 restructures. Metal and bone go to separate tracks. What carries plerametic charge we keep in shielded cages. What tastes like pure Chalabian craft we hang on hooks for later grafting. He wet his lips and went on, too eager now to stop himself. The gnosis we grow, he said, is more precious. The vials bred from advancement are our true choir books. Every candidate we raise, every warlock who climbs a step in the ladder, bleeds for us. Their spent crown ladders and modulation cocktails, the residues in their veins, all become recipes. We freeze them. We pull out threads of method and note them. We are building a library of ascents, Sacred One. A ledger of how mortals change when they drink deeper from the dark. And I realized that his faction were scientists of a sort. I wondered if Karoo knew about the harp of human hands, and the thought of the kind seemingly old man brought a smirk to my face that Severance made clearly portrayed he thought it was approval. He lifted his shackled hands a few centimeters, as if cradling something that only he could feel. "We have shelves of sleeping gnosis," he whispered. "All of it distilled from men and women who reached higher than their contracts allowed. We segment it into strains. The choir writes hymns that describe each one. The vials are our verses. We test them in the field when the ledgers allow it. We combine them with the glyph metal, with shards of orcish alloy, with stray demons we coax out of machine ghosts. We are making instruments that Keel does not have the language for." He looked up at me, eyes bright with fanaticism and fear. "And every time the iron rain falls," he said, "we get new notes. New metals. New broken spells to dissect. It accelerates our choir's climb." He seemed to catch himself then, suddenly aware of how much he had boasted, and ducked his head sharply. "Forgive the enthusiasm," he said. "We are very low and very small. We mean no presumption. It is only that you asked, and we so rarely have a listener who is not a clerk or a frightened apprentice." I let a small, indifferent smile touch my mouth. "It amuses me to watch you stack your stolen bones," I said. "You have explained how the rain feeds your chorus. Now explain the name. Why do you call it iron? Why rain? Make the words worth my time." He went very still. "It is not our name alone," he said carefully. "The lower plates have always had songs for it. Old maintenance crews called it the Iron Monsoon. Street cults and the fracture bands call it the Skyfall. We use Iron Rain because it is the words they use. It screeches across all signals before the attack." He hesitated, then went on. "The orcs and their false twin idols believe Iron Rain swells the iron tide." I cut him off, injecting with disdain. "Twin idols," I said. "False gods. Speak precisely. I have no metrics for the squabbles of these petty wolves." "Yes, Sacred One," he breathed. "Progress and war. The orcs carve them into their hulls. Their shamans paint them in blood on the inside of command pods. Two faces, one hunger. Progress, the eternal promise and the eternal lie. And war is a being of pure bloodlust." "And the tide?" I asked. "The tide is what they want," he said quietly. "A flood that never ebbs. A state where the guns never cool and the pods never stop falling. If the rain goes on long enough, if Keel's defenses do not hold, if the three decide that this front amuses them, the tide will rise. Our lives will drown in armies and projects. The scrap fields will become oceans of armor. Whole hives will be stripped for shells." He swallowed. I let out a low, genuine laugh. It echoed along the ribs of the hall. "You are ambitious, little Severance," I said. "You want the fruits of catastrophe without the inconvenience of extinction. Sensible. Gluttonous, but sensible." His shoulders trembled in the chains. "If that pleases you," he said quickly, "then we are content. We exist to knife the edges of events, not to command them. Only you sit high enough to see the whole plane. We scrape what falls from your attention." "You flatter me neatly," I said. "You have fed my curiosity. That is rare. Few mortals can hold my gaze for more than a few heartbeats. You have done so twice. It would be rude of me to ignore that." His head jerked up, eyes widening. "Sacred One," he whispered. "I do not deserve such notice." "Of course you do not," I said. "That is what makes it interesting." I let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, then tilted my head as if entertaining a small, private amusement. "Tell me, Severance," I said. "If I chose to be generous in this moment, what could a thing of my magnitude do for a mortal of such carefully hidden hubris?" Every muscle in his body seemed to tighten at once. His chains creaked. He opened his mouth, closed it, then bent his head again until his forehead brushed the stone. "I would not dare to ask," he said, voice hoarse. "You will," I said. "You have already started to compose the request. I can feel it. Speak it aloud. I still am bored enough to listen." He made a soft, strangled sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Mercy," he said. Then I will ask." He dragged air into his lungs as if it hurt, then forced the words up. "Grant me a slate," he said. "A fragment. A codex. A book of workings marked by your hand. Old rituals. True magics. Cuts and bind patterns that are not copied from corporate manuals. Something that carries your scent, so my peers will know that I did not dream you. Let me take proof back to the chorus that the higher shelves are not empty. That something beyond the three has looked at us and found us almost worth the time. His voice shook more with each sentence. By the end of it his hands were trembling in the shackles, metal ringing a thin, nervous note. Not a method to remake the strata, he added hastily. Not a key to your hall. I do not presume so far. Only a grimoire. A sheaf of elder cuts. So that when I say your name in our secret hymns, they will listen. So that I can grow my choir and prepare them to serve if you call again. He fell silent, breathing hard. Inside, panic flared cold and sharp in my chest. I had Ka'uru's explanations, nothing profound. I had scraps of liturgy that the church used as training wheels. I had my own domain, which I could not afford to expose. I did not have some ready volume of God's script to drop into his hands. Outwardly, I let my expression become thoughtful and distant. You ask for much, I said calmly. A page from a shelf that is not yours. A taste of a higher language. You do not lack nerve. He flinched. If it displeases you, he said quickly, burn the thought from me. I will scrape it out myself. I only thought that if you were inclined to any benevolence, I could make myself worthy of more of it. And what would you do with such a book, I asked, buying time. Recite it blindly. Trade it for favor. Misuse it until it kills you. And no, he said at once. We would study. We would compare. We would test small cuts under heavy wards. We would add your patterns to our choir books and let them refine our ears. Your generosity would not be wasted, sacred one. Every scrap you drop from your table becomes 40 new scripts in our vaults. We are good at this. It is all we are good at. He was not going to back away from the request. I felt the domain press against my awareness, waiting. Fine. I closed my eyes and reached for the ocular knob sense, not to map space this time, but to map memory. The gland surged to full strength with a cold, needling pressure. What I was doing was beyond the gland's capability as far as I knew, yet I could feel the path in my mind, literally in my mind's flesh, growing like a trail newly blazed. The hall wavered at the edges of my vision, its red mist brightening. I dragged internally across every page I had seen since coming to this world. Ka'uru's diagrams of gnosis composition. The old saints' marginal notes on binding rites. The church-approved ward patterns that apprentices were allowed to copy. The little corrections scribbled in the backs of manuals by tired instructors. I pulled them up one after another and pinned them in place. Pain flared along my temples and behind my eyes. It felt as if someone were driving fine screws into the bone. Not domain work, I reminded myself. Nothing that mentions my hall. Nothing that mentions the compass by name. No sigils that touch the protection wards of my domain. Nothing that would let the harp trace this throne back to Horus Yard or to me as anything but a mask. I skimmed mentally, sorting. I had combed through the records of the ancient converted saints, reading the Old English that almost no one else in this world could do more than stare at. From their lives I picked only what I judged safe to share: St. Helia's primera on concentric ward tessellations for lay exorcists, St. Marcellin's cheap parish filters for low-grade leaks, the third converted synod's standard ninefold binding for domestic spirits, a chain of margin-tagged counter-gnosis litanies marked for minor infestations, and a short catalogue of novice resonant scaffolds and bleed tests that those saints had all agreed were safe for children and catechumens. In all honesty, I had almost no idea what any of it was. I was making major leaps of context based on that old adage, judging a book by its cover. The words themselves I could understand, so that meant they were safe enough? The pressure in my head built. The bar ticked higher. I felt warmth on my upper lip. In the real world, outside the domain, blood had started to flow. I ignored it. The hull responded to my intent like a muscle I was still learning to move. The same way I had shaped the pendulum into an astrolabe, I reached into the red mist beside my throne and imagined a book. Not a corporate slate. Not a saint's printed manual. Something that matched the geometry of this place. A codex of bone-white plates bound with black wire. A spine of dull iron, banded in red. Pages etched with clean, angular script that combined the human notation of Horus Yard's manuals with something a little older. Each page carried one working. A cut. A ward. A modulation. Marginal glyphs marked danger levels and prerequisites. I did not know exactly how I had laid it out. The domain seemed to fill the gaps between my choices, smoothing the pages into a coherent whole. It felt like pouring remembered text into a mold. The book condensed out of the air above the long stone table, first as a dense knot of fog, then as something solid and heavy. It dropped the last few centimeters and landed with a sound like a small anvil being set down. The stone beneath it shivered. Severance flinched at the impact. His eyes locked on the codex. Even at a distance I could see that the pages were legible. The glyphs stayed still, no writhing, no optical tricks. This was not a trap book meant to devour its reader. It was a brutal, functional manual. My head throbbed. I lifted one hand and made a lazy gesture toward the codex. The book slid from the table into the space between Severance's shackled palms. The chains adjusted just enough to let his fingers close around the edges. He gasped. The weight dragged his hands down until the shackles bit into his wrists. For a moment he simply stared at it, breathing hard, as if he were afraid that any movement might break the illusion. "Open it," I said. I kept my tone bored, although my heart was hammering. He obeyed with painful care. The first plate creaked back. His eyes flicked rapidly over the opening page. His pupils dilated. The faint red ring around them brightened. "This is..." His voice failed. He swallowed and tried again. "These are folios I have never seen before. Cantos on word forms written in a hand I do not know. The scaffolds are wrong for keel systems, but they are complete. The modulations are real. The ratios. The angles. This is not a dream?" I let out a tiny giggle and inwardly it took everything I had. He turned another plate. Then another. Each time his eyes widened a little more. "It is a primer and a gospel in one," he whispered. "Not childish corporate catechism. Not a saint's half-burned diary. You have given me a book of worth." He laughed once, a dry cracked sound, and then bit it off, as if he feared that too much joy would offend me. "At the foot of each pattern," he said, voice shaking, "there are notes. Warnings. Variants. This is how a real power writes. Not in slogans. In margins." The compliment was not mine, but I accepted it anyway. "That fragment," I said, allowing a trace of warning into my tone, "is a flake from a shelf you are not meant to see. Do not pretend it belongs to you. Carry it. Cut yourself on it. Show it to those you trust. That is all." He bowed his head over the codex until his forehead touched the plates. "I will guard it with my devotion," he said. "I will let it carve us clean. Every harp note will change when they see this. They will know that I spoke truth. That I did not invent you. That there is a seat above the triumvirate that is not empty." He sounded almost giddy. "In return," he said, "we will listen harder. We will stack more bones. We will be ready when you find yourself bored enough to look down again." The domain shuddered faintly around us. The astrolabes rings at the far end of the hall were spinning faster than before, light tracing their edges. The pendulum arm had begun to swing in a wider arc, as if the strain on my mind had knocked it off-center. Pain burrowed behind my eyes. The warm trickle at the corner of my vision became a steady line. I felt a wetness inside my ears. I held onto the mask. "You have done well enough for one visit," I said. My voice came out a little tight, but still even. "You have sated my curiosity. That is not a small thing." Severance clutched the codex to his chest, chains grinding softly. "Sacred One," he breathed. "Thank you. Thank you. Do not make me regret it," I said. I bore easily. I lifted my hand in a dismissive wave. "I am tired of this game for now," I said. "Be gone." The hall took the cue. The red mist thickened around his chair, surging up from the floor in a sudden, smooth column. It wrapped the bound figure and the codex both. For a heartbeat I saw his eyes above the rising fog, bright and wild with a mix of terror and exultation. Then the mist closed. The chains went slack. The chair was empty. The astrolabe's ring slowed. The pendulum arm settled. The oppressive pressure of the domain eased all at once. I let go. The world snapped back into place like a rubber band. The roar of the gun slammed into my ears, raw and full. The tent walls snapped and shuddered with every distant impact. Dust rained steadily from the seams overhead. I was on my knees on the bedroll. My hands were braced on the canvas. My chest heaved. Something hot and wet ran from the corners of my eyes. When I wiped at it with the back of my hand, my glove came away streaked red. My ears felt clogged. When I swallowed, I tasted iron. The bar in my mind flickered and steadied at 43%. But the timer was blinking rapidly. I did not have time to parse what that meant. The whole strata shook with a new, closer detonation. The shockwave rattled the tent poles. Outside, Brask shouted my name, the words stretched thin with alarm. Marcy snapped something I could not catch over the continuing barrage. I dragged in one more breath, forced my spine straight, and reached for the tent flap with a hand that would not stop shaking, hoping I had not just given a pack of corporate warlocks enough teeth to bite through my own leash. Chapter 20, Cartography Part 3. Brask's shout pulled me the rest of the way out of the domain. Everett. Another impact hit close enough that the ground gave a short, miserable lurch. The pack fell and the mapping slate rattled across the floor of the tent and I had to grab it on reflex. I removed my glove and wiped my face with the heel of my hand. The hand came away streaked dark in the dim light. Eyes, nose, the corner of my mouth. The blood had already started to dry along my cheekbones in thin lines. I dragged the sleeve of my robe across it more vigorously, hard, until most of it blended into the general grime. There was no time to be delicate. Everett. Brask again, closer to panic than I liked hearing from him. "Coming," I said, and pushed my way out of the tent. The world outside was strobing. Light flared high above the superstructure ceiling, sharp and intermittent. Each flash came with a distant bark of something that might as well have been thunder, except I knew it was guns. The sound hit us a heartbeat later, rolling across the field expanse and shaking dust out of the ribs of the leaning towers around our camp. Far off, streaks of incandescent metal tore across the artificial sky and vanished behind the higher layers. A moment later, some of them reappeared lower down, trailing fire in broken fragments. The impacts came in irregular waves. A cluster toward our right. A swarm somewhere behind us. One single heavy strike close enough that I felt the concussion through my teeth. Brask crouched near the mouth of our little shelter, his body filling most of the gap. The fur along his spine was puffed despite himself. His ears flicked with every blast. Marcy had taken a knee beside one of the machine ribs, pistol braced, eyes scanning the horizon as if she expected something to climb out of the noise at any moment. They both looked at me when I stepped out. "You were not answering," Marcy said. Her gaze flicked briefly over my face and then away again. If she noticed the blood, she chose not to comment. "I was about to drag you out by the hood. Had trouble finding my boots," I lied. My throat felt raw. "What did I miss?" Brask gestured up with his chin. "It is getting worse, yes? The sky is throwing knives," he said. And I saw what he meant as another flash bloomed wide along the distant ceiling. The delayed crash made the metal beneath my feet hum. But that was the case for the whole superstructure. Shards of metal and debris were raining around us in the dark. I squinted into the bright and swallowed around the ache in my head. Marcy was watching me carefully as I tried to watch. Marcy glanced at me. "What?" "Iron rain," I pointed. "That is what some people call this, I think. There are guns above. Metal falling in waves, so I guess it has a name." Brask's ears tipped forward. "I do not like that it has a name." "Yes," he said. "Named things happen more often than unnamed things." "No? Have you heard it before?" I asked. "Iron rain. Iron tide." They exchanged a quick look. "No," Marcy said. "Quakes sure," she shrugged, "but nothing distinctly named like that." A fresh volley of impacts rolled across the ceiling before I could answer. For several seconds the whole world was flash and noise. The leaning towers nearest us shook and shed another thin curtain of dust. When it died down again, the silence felt thinner than before. "It fits," I said. "The name. Iron rain when it comes like this. Iron tide when it does not stop." "Does it stop?" Brask asked. His voice stayed low, like he was worried the guns might hear him asking. "Usually," I said. "If it did not, there would not be much left up there to argue over." Marcy narrowed her eyes. "You sound very sure for someone who is supposed to be seeing this for the first time," she said. "I have read more reports than is healthy," I said lightly and shrugged. "Old ones, stuff Ka-uru gave me training catechisms that no one bothers with. Ledgers, and records. This matches a few lines that stuck in my head. That was as close to a truth as I was willing to hand over." "So," Brask said slowly, "our pretty little city is punching at something over our heads. What is being punched?" "Chalabia," I said. "If the manuals were not lying. The moon world. The orc hives. Their shamans and whatever they pray to like to throw soldiers and machines down the well to see what sticks. Keel throws fire back up. When they both commit at once, you get this." Brask stared up at the furious ceiling. "Orcs," he said. "I thought they were for scary bedtime stories and high-bid mercenary contracts. Not this." "Stories come from somewhere," I said. Marcy's fingers tightened on the grip of her pistol. "How do you know that?" "I told you you cannot ask that." Marcy looked a minute then spoke. "If that is true," she said, "then those streaks are not just scrap. Some of them are shells with things inside. If the guns knock them off course instead of breaking them, the contents land." "Yes," I said, nodding, "and I don't think the contents are a good thing." Brask huffed out a breath that was not quite a laugh. "So we are the gutter," he said. All the interesting bits wash down to us, yes? It is just like home. We might not be alone much longer, I said. If we are not already. That held them both for a heartbeat. You think something landed near us? Marcy asked. I shook my head and shrugged. I think there is stuff everywhere, but I am more worried about things and people coming to investigate. With all this stuff falling, people are bound to look around. For example, don't gogs hate vibration? Brask's tail flicked once behind him. Yes, he said. They do. The big ones feel every step in the plates. We woke one by accident and it tried to shave us out of our skins. This will wake many. Exactly, I said. So it is not just what fell that worries me. It is what already lives here and hates this much noise. And it is whoever comes running to strip the bodies and the metal when the sky stops yelling. Brask grimaced. Scavengers, he said. Cultists. Harvest crews. Gogs. You make a very ugly parade, yes? All the more reason not to march in it, I said. We should make ourselves as boring as possible until this slows down. Marcy nodded once. That was the kind of plan she trusted. Fine, she said. We go to ground. No movement on the ridgeline. We let the first wave of idiots and monsters run past us. Then in the morning we take a look, I added. From high ground. If there is a crater close enough to matter, we want to see it before it finds us. Brask let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it since the first barrage. This I can live with, yes? He said. Hiding first, looking later. It feels almost like wisdom. No? Almost, Marcy said. Help me with the screen. We moved quickly. Together we dragged the tent a little deeper under the leaning support strut, until the slanted metal above hid most of its outline from any distant vantage point. Marcy kicked loose chunks of machine casing and old conduit into a rough barrier at the front, breaking up the clean lines of our camp. Brask went further out, scuffing the ground with his boots and tail to blur our footprints and roll stray debris into a more natural scatter. The harsh flashes from above became the only strong light, stuttering through gaps in the scrap like an erratic heartbeat. Each distant blast sent a fine powder of dust drifting down, but the strut over us took the worst of it. Inside the half-choked entrance, the air felt tighter. It also felt safer. Marcy settled near the mouth of the shelter where she could see out through the gaps in the scrap. Pistol across her knees. We sleep in turns, she said. Everett, you are already wired from whatever you are doing in here. You take first watch. Wake me when the guns slow down. Brask gets the quietest shift if there is one. That is discrimination against honest sleepers, Brask muttered as he ducked inside and curled up near the wall. His ears still pointed toward the sky despite the joke. You can file a complaint with Lenandris when we get back, Marcy said. If he does not assign you to the next 10 deep crawls for fun. Brask considered that, then closed his eyes. I withdraw my complaint, he said. I sat with my back to the cold machine rib, knees drawn up, mapping slate within reach. From here I could see the narrow slice of expanse through the gaps in our makeshift screen. The sky beyond the superstructure kept flaring and dimming in ugly rhythms. Just to be clear, Marcy said quietly, not looking away from the opening, if we go to look tomorrow and you decide it is too strange, we leave. Yeah? I don't mean we go back to the yard. But we avoid whatever it is. Yes, I said. We are here to map, not to wrestle whatever crawled out of Chalabia's toys. Good, she said. I do not like the idea of wrestling things that fell out of the sky. Another wave of distant impacts rolled across the plate, further away this time. The vibration reached us as a low, steady tremor instead of a sharp jolt. The worst of the barrage was already moving on. I listened to it fade, eyes on the thin slice of horizon. Barely lit by the distant explosions. Time passed in small, measured pieces. I kept my back against the cold machine rib and let my mind walk circles while the sky tried to shake itself apart. I thought about the crater that might be waiting for us. About pods that missed their mark and buried themselves in the wrong strata. About things inside those pods that might not care whose side anyone claimed to be on. When my thoughts tired of that, they went back to the bar in my head. It sat at the edge of my vision whenever I let my focus go slack, a row of pale digits that had once appeared and steadied and now seemed to flicker and tick only between one heartbeat and the next. The timer did not seem to care about context. Somehow it seemed like it cared about thresholds and rules that no one had bothered to explain to me. I had to try and guess the rule set anyway. Maybe it was something simpler, like a stopwatch quietly tracking time on a life. I wondered how the timer looked when the Puritan had seen his before his body failed. That was the point where I cut the thought off. I had enough intrusive images without borrowing more. The barrage faded one layer at a time, like doors closing in a long corridor. The intervals between impacts stretched. The flashes along the ceiling became less frequent and more distant. Dust still sifted from the beams, but it came in lazy drifts instead of sharp showers. When the gap between blasts grew long enough that my shoulders finally unclenched, I checked the wall of my awareness again. The timer still pulsed with that slow, irregular blink. Unstable. Just rising, not falling. Just breathing in a way it had never done before. "That is new," I murmured under my breath. Marcy shifted slightly at the mouth of the shelter but did not look back. She probably thought I was talking to myself about the guns. I waited a few minutes more, counting impacts. None came. The ceiling stayed dark, except for the occasional ghost glow of distant fires. The tremors underfoot dwindled to a low ache. "Marcy," I said quietly. "Your turn." "It is easing." She nodded without taking her eyes from the gaps in the scrap. Only after she had listened for a while longer did she look back. "Anything obvious move while I was out?" she asked. "Nothing close," I said. "We can take a better look in daylight." Her gaze rested on my face a little longer than I liked. If she noticed the drying streaks at the edge of my jaw, she still did not comment. "Sleep," she said. "You are starting to sound exhausted." "That is uncalled for," I said. She allowed herself a small smile and turned back to the opening. I shifted sideways and crawled into the tent's half-shadow. Brask had already claimed most of the inner wall, curled on his side with his tail tucked close. His ears still twitched at every distant rumble, but his breathing was slow. The explosions had finally failed to keep him awake. I lowered myself onto the pallet between them, feeling every knot in the woven fabric. The air held the sour tang of fierce sweat, dust, and the faint waxy scent of the heat tap. Sleep felt impossible with the memory of the iron rain still hammering the inside of my skull, but exhaustion did not ask permission. As I let my eyes close, the bar in my mind floated closer, as if the darkness invited it in. "What are you counting?" I whispered to it, but there was no answer. Then the blink stretched, lengthened, and something else slid into its place. A line of text shimmered at the edge of my thoughts, not in any font I had seen on corporate interfaces, not in any of Kaoru's toolkits, but in the same clear, absolute way the Crown always chose when it wanted to make a point. Glandular mutation gnosis achieved. Ocular nerve gland pattern advanced, dual helix lattice grown. Creative recall nerve lattice formed. Skill gained, creative recall available. A warm heaviness wrapped around that pressure at the same time, like the afterburn of sedatives. The wet growth in my head pulsed once, twice, and then the sensation slid sideways toward sleep instead of pain. Of course, I thought muzzily. New gland, new problems. Then the red mist of my domain tried to rise up and swallow the iron rain, and for a while I did not dream about anything clearly enough to make sense of it. When I woke, it was to silence. Not complete silence. The expanse never went that far. There was always the distant groan of metal adjusting to loads it had carried for too long, the faint hiss of air moving through broken ducts, the soft tick of cooling surfaces. But the guns and explosions were gone. I lay still for a moment, listening. No thunder. No lurching concussions. Only the soft rasp of Brask's breath and the quieter sound of Marcy shifting her weight outside the tent. The timer bar sat where it always did. The number there still blinked, but the rhythm had changed again. Slower now. Almost thoughtful. It was not reassuring. My head hurt in a new way. The old ache from overusing the ocular knob sense had settled into a dull band across my brow, but under that lived a second sensation. A kind of tautness, as if certain pathways behind my eyes had been pulled snug and were waiting to be tested. I rolled onto one elbow and pushed myself upright. My joints complained. The air in the tent felt stale. "Welcome back," Marcy said quietly from the entrance. She had not turned around, but the angle of her head told me she had heard me move. "No thunder?" I asked. My voice came out rough. "None," she said. "Gave out a while ago. I kept waiting for it to start again, but it did not. The sky might be tired. Or reloading," I said. "Let me lie to myself a little, Everett," she said. I could not argue with that. Brask made a low noise and uncurled, blinking at the dim light filtering through the patched fabric overhead. "We live," he said. "Good news." "Try not to sound so surprised," I said. He grinned and pushed himself up onto one elbow. "I am always surprised. It keeps life interesting, yes?" Marcy shifted to let more light in. The day cycle white had returned, leaching through gaps in the superstructure above. It was thinner than before and carried a hint of smoke, as if everything had been dusted with ash. "We should move," she said. "Before whoever the iron rain invited gets settled." "Agreed," I said. I reached for my pack and paused. The tautness behind my eyes pulsed, as if sensing my attention. "Fine," I whispered internally. "Let us see what you are." I picked a simple anchor point. The inside of the tent, from my pallet outward. The mess of our gear. The faint chalky smear where dust had sifted in overnight. I let my gaze drift slowly over it, then focused on a single breath, in and out. Something inside my head clicked, a wet, soft sensation like two surfaces sliding into alignment. The world went flat. For 1 second my vision filled with a perfectly still image of the tent. No motion. No depth shift when I moved my head. It felt like staring at a printed page pressed directly against my eyes. Panic flared. I jerked my head to the side. The view did not change. It stayed locked, exactly as it had been in the instant I had chosen. Every wrinkle in the fabric. Every line of dust on the floor. Then, just as abruptly, it released. The overlay thinned and slid backward in my awareness, taking up a position just behind normal sight, like a sheet of glass leaned against a wall. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "Everett," Marcy said. "You just went very still. Is your head doing anything we should worry about?" "Define should," I said before I could stop myself. She shot me a look over her shoulder. I rubbed my eyes with my thumb and forefinger, careful not to prod any tender spots. "The crown pushed a change last night," I admitted. "New branch on the gland. I think it gave me a way to hold images." "Isn't it just like memory sight?" Brask said, sitting up fully now. "More precise," I said slowly, feeling my way through the description. "Memory sight maps routes and spaces. It feels like a sense, like a pressure field. This is more like a snapshot. A perfect still frame. I can call it back and look at it later. Every angle is fixed." Brask frowned. "So you can stare at my handsome face for hours after I leave?" "Yes," he said. "This is very worrying." "No? Useful for maps, though," Marcy said. "And for the church, when they realize you can do it." "Yes," I said. "That part worries me more than Brask's face." The earth-trained part of my mind chimed in with its own list of worries. New neural growth did not come free. Tumors did not ask permission before they rewrote tissue. The crown was cleverer than uncontrolled cancer, but it was still making changes in a skull that had not been built for this. Every new skill felt like another spin of a wheel I could not see. The timer in my vision blinked again, slow and steady as if to remind me it was also watching. "Do you want to tell Kaoru?" Marcy asked. "Eventually," I said. "After we are not sitting in the open under the world's worst shooting gallery. For now, we use what we can and pretend the rest is normal." "That is already how the church works," she said dryly. Brask stretched, joints cracking loudly. "I vote for not eating here," he said. "My stomach is brave, but the smell of smoke makes it think of burned gogs." "Yes? We move first," Marcy agreed. "Water now, rations later." "Everett, you wanted high ground." "Yes," I said. "Let me see what changed." We stepped out from under the strut. The field expanse looked different. Not cleaner, not worse. Just rearranged. Smoke hung in the air in thin, twisting columns that traced invisible paths between vents and broken ducts high overhead. Some columns rose straight up until they vanished into the higher haze. Others bent sharply as they hit unexpected crosswinds, drawn sideways through gaps in the superstructure. The patterns made my head hurt to follow. The air currents here had never obeyed any rule set I recognized. Patches of ash now covered stretches of ground that had been bare metal the day before. New fractures spiderwebbed across distant plates where impacts had hit. One leaning tower that had been a clear landmark was now missing its top third, jagged stump still smoking. "Still want to call it home away from home?" I asked Brask quietly. He considered for a moment. "It is home with new furniture, yes?" he said. "Ugly furniture." Marcy scanned the horizon, then pointed toward a ridge of collapsed machinery to our left. "High ground there," she said. "You can do your compass thing without us standing in the open." "Works for me," I said. We picked our way up the slope, boots sliding on loose fragments. Twice I put a hand against the side of a rusted conduit to steady myself and felt the faint residual warmth of some recent friction. The iron rain had scraped these surfaces harder than the wind ever could. At the top of the ridge, we crouched among the jagged remains of what might once have been a conveyor assembly. From here, the view opened out. The expanse stretched in a bruised sweep of ash, metal, and strange growths. Smoke plumes marked distant impact points like new, ugly spires. "All right," I said softly. "Let us see where the gutter overflowed." I called the ocular knob sense up in a slow spill instead of a hard surge. The familiar pressure washed through my skull, mapping distances and planes, painting a faint wireframe over the landscape in my thoughts. Pain followed a heartbeat later, sharper than usual, a reminder of how hard I had pushed it in the domain. Easy, I told myself. Short pulses. I let the sense spread for a count of 3 and then layered creative recall over it, trying to catch the view in one clean frame before the ache built too much. The wet click came again. The world froze. In the locked stillness, the ocular knob lines stood out with startling clarity. Every slope. Every drop. Every cluster of debris. The ghost trajectory of several streaks of metal still glowed in the air like faint scars. My temples throbbed. I let the snapshot slide backward, storing it where the other image of the tent now rested, and dropped the sense before the pain tipped into nausea. Brask watched me through the corner of his eye, trying not to look like he was worried. "Well," he said after a moment. "You see our doom." "Yes? Maybe," I said with sarcastic exasperation. I pointed toward a section of plate about a few hundred meters out and a little below our current level. The surface there had collapsed inward in a rough circle, the edges curled up as if something heavy had punched straight through from above. Thin smoke still leaked from the hole, drawn slowly sideways by the strange winds. "There," I said. Something came through the plate and did not stop. "That is the nearest significant breach. The others are further out or in quadrants we were told not to touch." Marcy narrowed her eyes, tracking along my finger. "How deep do you think?" she asked. "Hard to say from here," I said. "Judging by the curl on the edges and the pattern of cracks, not all that deep, probably into a mid-cavity or service chamber, could be Gogs, who knows." I shrug, "but they are trapped down there I think." Brask clicked his tongue. "Better, yes," he said. "It is easier when the rats are trapped, no? Assuming there are enemies," I said. He gave me a look. "Assuming," I repeated, and did not push it further. Marcy chewed the inside of her cheek. "We cannot go straight to it," she said. "Too exposed. Too much loose ground. Any survivor with half a brain or a functioning sensor array will see us coming." "I thought the same," I said. "There is a pipeway that runs most of the way along that side." I traced the route in the air, using what I had fixed in my snapshot. "If we drop off this ridge, cut across to the pipe spine, and follow it along the shadow side, we can approach from above and behind. We can look down into the breach before we decide whether to get closer. You can see the pipeway from here, no?" Brask said, skeptical. "In my head," I said. "Creative recall. The skill. That is what it gave me. The ridge, the slope, the pipe's anchor points. They are all there." Marcy glanced between us. "Can you put it on the slate?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Give me a moment." We hunkered lower in the rusted carcass of the conveyor while I dug the cartographic slate out of my pack. The surface woke under my touch, grid lines blooming softly. I pulled the stored image forward, not over my eyes this time, but just far enough to sit at the front of my thoughts. Guided by it, my hand moved more surely than it had the night before. Lines flowed into place. The ridge we crouched on. The camp under the strut. The collapse ring where the pod had gone through. The pipeway that jogged across the terrain like a bent spine. Every time my memory wavered, I let the still frame sharpen again until the missing detail snapped into focus. The ache behind my eyes built slowly, but it stayed manageable as long as I did not try to hold too much at once. When I finished, I turned the slate so they could see. Brask squinted. "This looks very professional," he said. "I am offended." "Yes?" Marcy tapped a point along the pipe's shadow side. "If we drop in here," she said, "we can stay behind this bulge until we are almost above the hole. Good sightlines. Some cover. If something comes out, we can retreat along the top instead of dropping straight into its mouth." "Exactly," I said. Brask traced the line from the camp to the ridge with one blunt claw. "How long?" he asked. "At our usual cautious pace," Marcy said, "less than half a day. Faster if we are willing to risk loose footing." "We are not," I said. "If anything down there survived, it will still be there whether we arrive an hour sooner or not. Rushing only increases our chances of falling into a crack and breaking our legs before we even see it." Brask sighed. "You both have no sense of drama, yes?" he said. "We are trying to stay out of the kind of drama that ends in reports with our names on the casualty line," I said. He considered this, then nodded. "Fine. Careful drama." Marcy tilted the slate back toward me. "Mark the camp," she said. "In case we need to reference this later." I added a symbol at the depression under the strut, then dimmed the grid and slid the slate back into my pack. The act of letting the image go made the tension behind my eyes ease a fraction. "All right," I said. We have a plan. No breakfast, slow pace, shadow drought. We look, we decide, we report later if we live. Brask bared his teeth in what he probably thought was an encouraging smile. You make it sound so simple, Monk. If we start adding complications now, I said, the crater will not even need to try. We climbed back down from the ridge, using the same handholds we had taken up. At the bottom, our camp looked smaller, half hidden under the leaning strut and the scrap screen. We broke what little remained of it down quickly. The tent came apart in practiced motions and folded into Brask's pack. We left the debris screen roughly in place behind us. It would read as one more patch of junk in a landscape of junk. Marcy took point for the first leg, guiding us along the contour lines I had sketched. Brask ranged half a pace to the side, sniffing occasionally, ears rotating. I kept the map alive in my head and checked our position against it every so often with a short, careful pulse of memory sight. Each use tugged at the new lattice behind my eyes, but in a way that felt more like exercise than damage. The expanse around us carried more scars the closer we drew to the impact band. Shallow craters filled with ash. Blackened struts that still smoldered at the edges. Once, we passed a slab of metal embedded at an angle in the ground, still too hot to touch. Its edges were fused in a way that spoke of impossible speeds and sudden stops. Those scrap crews you mentioned will be licking their lips, yes? Brask muttered as we skirted it. If they are not already dead trying to pry this up. Let us try not to join them, I said. The pipeway came into view as a long, rusted cylinder half buried in the terrain ahead, just where my map said it would be. It rose gradually from the ash, gaining height until it stood waist-high, then chest-high, then taller than Brask. Its surface was pitted and scarred, but intact. A faint vibration ran through it when I laid a hand against it, some distant pump still moving fluid or air through its interior. We walk on this, Brask asked. Beside it, Marcy said. On the shadow side. It breaks the line of sight from the crater if anything down there is still looking up. We fell into a new formation. Marcy closest to the pipe, one hand trailing lightly along it for balance. I walked just outside her, watching the terrain ahead and checking it against the stored image when needed. Brask took the outermost position, where his height gave him a slightly better view over the lower debris fields. The closer we came to the mark I had set on the slate, the more the air changed. There was a new smell now under the ever-present dust and metal. A burnt, unfamiliar tang that prickled at the back of my throat. It was not fungal. It was not any solvent I recognized from Ka'uru's lab. It carried a hint of oil and something like old blood, but not human. Brask wrinkled his nose. That is not ours, yes? He said. No, I agreed. That smells like someone else's problem. Soon to be ours, Marcy said. We slowed as the pipe curved gently, following the contour of a plate edge. The ground fell away on our right, opening into a shallow basin choked with ash and broken components. Beyond that, at the far side of the basin, the plate gave way entirely in a rough-edged ring. The impact site sat where my map said it would, a punched-out circle of torn metal and cracked support beams, still coughing up thin threads of smoke. We halted together at the curve's apex, just before the pipe's shadow line would end and expose us to a clear line of sight from the breach. There, I said quietly. We made it. Marcy sank into a crouch and peered over the edge of the pipe's shadow, eyes narrowed. Brask leaned forward just enough to see, muscles coiled, ears low with focus. From here, we could look down into the basin and across to the crater without yet offering our silhouettes in return. Whatever had fallen from the iron rain had gone through the plate and into something below. The hole itself was jagged, edges bent inward. Around it, the ash and loose debris had been blasted back, creating a bare ring like a shallow moat. Within the darkness of the hole itself, something gleamed faintly, as if catching the thin light in ways the surrounding metal did not. Well, Brask murmured. That is new. I felt the new lattice behind my eyes tighten again, hungry for detail. Not yet, I told it silently. We look first. Then we decide how much more of you I can afford to spend. For the moment, we stayed in the shadow of the pipe and watched the wound in the plate, waiting to see if anything inside moved.